Winter came to Ravenmarch like an executioner's blade, slow and merciless, turning the Highlands into a graveyard of frozen stone and dying hope. Duke Cadric Thornwell stood alone in the great hall, black coat heavy with snow, watching servants dismantle portraits of his late wife while noble families across the kingdom sharpened knives behind velvet curtains. Power had always been his armor, but tonight the castle felt like a tomb he'd built with his own hands. The question wasn't whether he'd survive what came next. The question was whether survival would even matter anymore. Stay with me through the darkness ahead, because what happens when the most dangerous man in the kingdom discovers he's been played by everyone he ever trusted will shatter everything you think you know about power, betrayal, and the price of loving something you can never truly protect. Bam! The fire in the Duke's private study burned low, casting shadows that moved like accusations across stone walls. Cadric sat behind the mahogany desk his father had commissioned 40 years ago, the wood scarred with decisions that had cost men their lives and families their futures. Outside, wind howled through Ravenmarch's corridors, like wolves searching for something already dead. He stared at the letter in his hand. 3 sentences. Unsigned. Delivered by a servant who'd vanished before dawn. Your wife didn't die by accident. The poison came from inside your house. Ask yourself who benefits most from a grieving duke. The parchment crumpled in his fist. 2 years. 2 years of believing Elise had succumbed to winter fever while he'd been negotiating trade agreements in the southern provinces. 2 years of guilt that ate through his chest like acid because he hadn't been there when she needed him most. 2 years of building walls so high that even his own reflection had become a stranger. Now this. A knock shattered the silence. Enter. Lord Brennan Vale pushed through the door, silver hair disheveled, face flushed from climbing the tower stairs too quickly for a man his age. The royal advisor had served 3 monarchs and survived 4 attempted coups, which meant he understood survival better than most men understood their own names. Your Grace, the council convenes in 20 minutes. The crown's emissary arrived an hour ago with Ochi Ishipamit Boar Bas. I know what he brought. Cadric didn't look up. Accusations, demands, the same political theater we've danced through for years. It's different this time. Brennan closed the door carefully. House Valamon and House Carlisle have formally requested a royal investigation into the Duchess's death. They're claiming you ordered her poisoned to consolidate power before expanding military operations into their territories. Kedric's jaw tightened. Bold words from families who've spent the last decade embezzling crown taxes and bribing judges. Bold words from families who smell blood in the water. Brennan stepped closer, voice dropping. The emissary brought signed testimonies from 3 servants claiming they witnessed suspicious activity in the Duchess's chambers the week she died. Physicians willing to testify that the fever symptoms matched known poisons. Even correspondence suggesting you discussed eliminating political obstacles months before her death. All fabricated. Of course it's fabricated, but fabrication doesn't matter when half the kingdom wants you gone and the other half is too terrified to defend you. Cadric finally looked up, eyes dark as the sea beyond the cliffs. Then perhaps it's time they remembered why fear exists. That's exactly what they're counting on. Brennan's voice carried the weight of too many wars watched from castle balconies. They want you to react with violence. They want you to prove you're the monster they've been whispering about. One wrong move, and the crown will have justification to strip your title, seize your lands, and install a more compliant lord in Ravenmarch. The Duke stood slowly, moving to the window overlooking the frozen courtyard below. Snow covered everything like a shroud. Soldiers drilled in formation despite the cold, breath rising in frozen clouds, swords flashing beneath gray light. Every one of them would die for him if he gave the order. The question was how many deaths it would take before he became exactly what they accused him of being. There's more. Brennan's tone shifted into something careful. The agreement your predecessor made with House Vale 15 years ago. The one involving collateral for protection during the Northern rebellions. I know about the agreement. Then you know it includes a marriage clause that was never fulfilled. Vale's daughter. The debt is still outstanding, and with their house now bankrupt from the grain failures last season, they're calling it due. Bal Basult. Cadric turned sharply. Vale wants to force a marriage contract now? While I'm under investigation for murdering my last wife, Vale wants protection from what's coming. His creditors will seize everything he owns within 3 months, unless someone powerful enough intervenes. And you're the only power north of the capital that House Valamont and House Carlisle genuinely fear. Brennan paused. The daughter arrives tomorrow morning. Her name is Seraphina. The name hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. A political hostage dressed as a bride. Kadrick's voice carried no emotion. How perfectly convenient. Convenient for Vale. Dangerous for you. Every noble in the kingdom will see it as confirmation that you collect women like trophies and discard them when they become inconvenient. Then they'll see what they've already decided to see. Your Grace, Enough. Kadrick moved back to the desk, pulling correspondence from a locked drawer. If House Valamont and House Carlisle want a war built on lies, I'll give them something worth dying over. But first I need to know who wrote that letter. He tossed the crumpled parchment across the desk. Brennan read it quickly, face draining of color. This is treason to even possess, which means whoever sent it either wants me to investigate my own household or wants me to destroy myself trying. Either way, someone inside Ravenmarch knows exactly what happened to Elise. Kadrick's voice went cold. Find them. Use whatever methods necessary. I want names before the week ends. And the council meeting? Yes, I'll attend. I'll listen to their accusations and their demands and their carefully rehearsed outrage. And then I'll remind them that Ravenmarch doesn't negotiate with opportunists who mistake a funeral for an invitation to seize power. Brennan studied him for a long moment. They'll call it a declaration of war. Good. Let them come with armies instead of forged testimony. At least a blade to the throat has the virtue of honesty. Yes, Sammy. The old advisor nodded slowly, understanding what wasn't being said. This wasn't about defending honor or proving innocence. This was about a man who'd spent 2 years building a fortress around his grief, finally deciding that maybe the fortress had always been a prison. After Brennan left, Kadrick stood alone in the study, staring at the portrait of Elise that still hung above the fireplace. She'd hated having her likeness painted, said it felt like trying to trap something living inside a frame. But he'd insisted, wanting something permanent in a world where everything eventually turned to dust. Now the painted eyes looked down at him like a judgment he couldn't escape. I should have been there, he said to the empty room. I should have known. See. The fire crackled. The wind answered with silence. And somewhere in the castle below, servants prepared chambers for a woman who would arrive tomorrow morning as collateral for her father's mistakes. Walking into a household where the last woman to bear the title Duchess had been murdered by someone still breathing the same air. The council chamber felt like a courtroom built to guarantee conviction. Long table carved from northern oak, chairs positioned to create hierarchy, windows designed to let in cold light that made everyone look guilty of something. Kadrick entered last, black coat trailing behind him, boots echoing against stone as nobles rose from their seats, with expressions ranging from fear to poorly concealed satisfaction. At the head of the table sat Lord Emissary Aldrich Thorne, the crown's representative, wearing royal colors and the kind of smile that promised nothing good. Beside him, Lord Nathaniel Valamont and Lady Cordelia Carlisle occupied seats they had no right to claim, but power had stopped caring about rights the moment it discovered leverage. Your Grace. Aldrich stood with rehearsed courtesy. Thank you for joining us. Stan. Kadrick didn't sit. This is my castle, Aldrich. I don't require invitations to occupy my own halls. The temperature in the room dropped several degrees. Aldrich's smile thinned. Of course. We simply wish to discuss certain concerns that have reached the Crown regarding events 2 years past. Events? Kadrick's voice was flat. Is that what we're calling the death of my wife now? Does. Nathaniel Valamont leaned forward, gray beard perfectly trimmed, eyes calculating behind false sympathy. We understand this is difficult, Your Grace. But when questions arise about the circumstances surrounding a duchess's sudden passing, particularly when that duchess stood to inherit significant holdings that would have complicated certain territorial arrangements, Choose your next words carefully, Nathaniel. You're about to accuse a duke of murder while sitting in his fortress surrounded by his soldiers. Make certain the accusation is worth whatever comes after. Lady Cordelia Carlyle spoke before Nathaniel could respond, her voice smooth as poisoned wine. No one is accusing you of anything, Your Grace. We're simply concerned citizens seeking clarity. Surely you understand the need for transparency when rumors spread through the kingdom like plague. Yeah, atrat. Rumors you helped cultivate. Rumors that existed before we gave them voice. Cordelia's red dress seemed to drink the light from the windows. Tell me, Your Grace, why did you order all servants present during the Duchess's final days reassigned to distant posts within a month of her death? Why were the royal physicians never allowed to examine the body? Why was she buried so quickly, before even her own family could travel north for the funeral? Kedrick's hands remained perfectly still on the back of the chair before him. Because I was grieving. Because the woman I loved died while I was gone, and I couldn't stand the sight of everyone searching for meaning in tragedy that had no meaning. Because sometimes death is just death, not a conspiracy wrapped in silk accusations. A beautiful sentiment. Aldrich shuffled parchment across the table. Unfortunately, these testimonies suggest otherwise. 3 servants willing to swear before the crown that they witnessed a physician entering the Duchess's chambers the night before her fever worsened. A physician you personally hired. A physician who vanished 2 weeks after her death and hasn't been seen since. The document slid across polished wood until it stopped directly before where Kedrick stood. He didn't look at it. Forgeries, paid testimony, desperation dressed as evidence. Perhaps. Aldrich folded his hands. But the Crown takes accusations of this nature seriously, regardless of the accused's title or influence. You'll submit to formal questioning in the capital within the month. You'll provide records of all correspondence related to the Duchess's illness, and you'll allow royal investigators access to Ravenmarch's staff for interviews. And if I refuse, the room went silent except for wind rattling the windows. Nathaniel answered, voice carrying the confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. Then the Crown will interpret your refusal as confirmation of guilt. Your titles will be suspended pending investigation. Your assets frozen. Your military authority transferred to a provisional council until the matter resolves itself. In other words, you'll strip everything I've built and divide it among yourselves while pretending it's justice. Kedrick finally moved, walking slowly around the table, forcing them to turn in their chairs to follow his path. Tell me, Nathaniel, what happens to House Vale's debts if I'm removed from power? Who assumes responsibility for your daughter's marriage contract when the man who holds the agreement no longer has authority to honor it? So Nathaniel's face flushed. This isn't about my house's finances. Everything is about finances. You're bankrupt. Cordelia's house lost 3 major trade routes to my operations last year. The Crown tolerates my expansion because it profits from my success. But you've convinced Aldrich here that a weakened Ravenmarch creates opportunities for redistribution. Kedrick stopped behind his own chair, hands gripping the wood. This isn't an investigation. It's a coordinated execution disguised as concern for my dead wife's memory. Your paranoia is showing, Your Grace. Cordelia's tone remained infuriatingly calm. We're simply ensuring the rule of law applies equally, regardless of how much gold or fear a man commands. Law? You want to lecture me about law? Kedrick leaned forward slightly, just enough to make everyone at the table unconsciously lean back. I've spent 15 years enforcing law in territories you'd never set foot in without armed guards. I've rebuilt trade systems, rooted out corruption, stabilized borders your families had bled dry through incompetence and greed. And now you want to dismantle that work because you finally realized you can't compete with it. We want accountability. Aldrich's voice hardened. Something you seem allergic to providing. Then let me provide some accountability right now. Kedrick pulled a sealed envelope from inside his coat, dropping it on the table with enough force to make several nobles flinch. Those are records of every bribe House Valamont paid to Crown auditors over the past 5 years. Tax evasion, falsified trade reports, Payments to judges overseeing land disputes in your favor. I've had them for months, waiting to see if you'd be stupid enough to move against me openly." Nathaniel's face went pale. "Those are private. They're evidence. Which is what you wanted, isn't it? Evidence that proves someone has been acting outside the law?" Cadric straightened. "I also have similar documentation for House Carlisle's operations, smuggling routes, unlicensed mining operations on Crown land, payments to mercenary groups that attacked rival trading caravans." Cordelia's composure cracked slightly. "You're bluffing. Boy. Mom, test me. Push this investigation forward and watch me deliver those records to every magistrate and royal official between here and the capital. Let's see whose house crumbles faster under real scrutiny." Aldrich stood slowly, face tight with barely controlled anger. "Threatening crown officials is treason, Your Grace." "What bots?" "I'm not threatening anyone. I'm explaining the cost of the war you're trying to start." Cadric's voice went quiet, which somehow made it more dangerous. "You want to investigate my wife's death? Fine. Send your investigators. Interview every servant. Dig through every record. You won't find anything because there's nothing to find except a woman who died from fever while surrounded by physicians who failed to save her. But if you think I'll sit quietly while you manufacture evidence and forge testimonies to justify seizing everything I've built, you've forgotten who you're dealing with. I don't play defensive games. I don't negotiate with opportunists. And I sure as hell don't surrender to people stupid enough to mistake patience for weakness." Silence consumed the chamber. Finally, Aldrich spoke, voice carefully controlled. "The Crown will expect your cooperation within the month, Your Grace. Refusal will be noted in our official report. Note whatever you want, but understand this." Cadric leaned both hands on the table, forcing eye contact with each person present. "Ravenmarch has survived invasions, plagues, civil wars, and a dozen noble houses that thought they could break it through politics or force. It's still standing. They're all dust. I won't let my wife's memory be used as leverage for your ambitions. And if you push this too far, you'll discover that a man with nothing left to lose becomes infinitely more dangerous than any title or fortune could ever make him." He straightened, moved toward the door. "The meeting is over. Get out of my castle." No one moved immediately, uncertainty freezing them in place. Cadric stopped at the threshold, voice dropping to something cold and final. "Now, dice, but pray on the." Chairs scraped, robes rustled. Within 2 minutes, the chamber had emptied, except for Brennan, who'd remained silent throughout the entire exchange, standing near the windows like a ghost watching history repeat itself. "That could have gone better," the old advisor said quietly. "That went exactly as it needed to." Cadric stared at the empty chairs, jaw tight. "They came here expecting me to beg, to negotiate, to prove I'm afraid of what they can take from me. And instead you declared war. I declared honesty. If they want a war, they'll get one, but it'll be fought on my terms, not theirs." Brennan walked closer, voice careful. "And the girl? Vale's daughter? She arrives tomorrow morning into the middle of this chaos." Cadric said nothing for a long moment, staring at the table where accusations had been stacked like cordwood, waiting for a match. Then she'll learn very quickly what kind of house she's entered, and whether she's strong enough to survive it. Morning came wrapped in fresh snow, and the kind of cold that made breathing feel like swallowing broken glass. Cadric stood in the main courtyard, watching servants prepare the entrance for Lady Seraphina Vale's arrival, banners snapping violently overhead in wind that refused to acknowledge spring would eventually come. He hadn't slept. The letter about Elise's murder sat in his study like a grenade with the pin already pulled, and every hour that passed without answers made his jaw tighten another degree. Someone inside Ravenmarch knew the truth. Someone had poisoned his wife and then watched him grieve for 2 years without saying a word. Finding them would require patience he no longer possessed. "Your Grace, it is..." Captain Marcus Holt approached from the garrison, armor dull from night patrol, face weathered from too many winters spent keeping Ravenmarch's walls secure. He'd served under Cadric's father and survived 3 assassination attempts, which made him either incredibly skilled or too stubborn to die properly. "The perimeter is secure. No unusual activity overnight, but the men are talking about yesterday's council meeting. Rumors are spreading that House Valamont and House Carlisle are preparing for conflict. Well, Let them prepare. It'll give us time to decide where to bury them. Marcus's mouth twitched into something that might have been a smile 30 years ago. And the girl arriving today? Orders regarding her security? Standard protocols. 2 guards outside her chambers at all times. No servants assigned without background verification. And I want reports on anyone who approaches her beyond what's necessary for basic hospitality. You don't trust Vale's motives. I don't trust anyone's motives. Kedrick pulled his coat tighter against the wind. Her father sold her as collateral to save his own fortune. That makes her either desperate enough to be dangerous or broken enough to be useless. Either way, she's a piece on a board I didn't ask to play on. Sir, if I may, you may not. Marcus nodded, understanding dismissed when he heard it. He turned to leave, then stopped. For what it's worth, Your Grace, the men believe you. About the Duchess. They don't think you had anything to do with her death. The men believe I'm capable of violence when necessary. That's not the same as innocence. Maybe not, but it's something. After Marcus left, Kaedric remained in the courtyard, watching steam rise from his breath like ghosts that refused to settle. Somewhere beyond the castle walls, nobles were drafting letters and forming alliances and counting the days until they could move against him openly. Let them come. He'd built Ravenmarch into a fortress, not because he loved power, but because he understood what happened to men who mistook diplomacy for protection. The kingdom ran on violence barely contained by ceremony and law. Remove the ceremony, and all that remained was the violence underneath. At least violence had the virtue of being honest about what it was. The sound of carriage wheels on frozen stone announced Seraphina Vale's arrival before the gates even opened. Kedrick didn't move, didn't adjust his expression, didn't offer any indication that this moment mattered beyond basic obligation. The carriage rolled through the entrance, black lacquer scratched from rough roads, wheels caked with mud despite the snow. 2 guards accompanied it, barely enough protection for a merchant's daughter, let alone nobility traveling through hostile territory. Nathaniel Vale hadn't even bothered to make the journey himself. The carriage stopped. A servant rushed forward to open the door, and Lady Seraphina Vale stepped onto Ravenmarch's stones like she'd been preparing for this moment her entire life. She wore silver velvet despite the cold, no fur or heavy cloak, hair dark as midnight falling past her shoulders without pretense of elaborate styling. But what struck Kaedric wasn't the clothes or the calculated composure, it was her eyes, gray, storm gray. Looking directly at him without hesitation or fear, or the performative submission every other noble woman had offered since Elisa's death. She walked forward across snow-covered stone, stopped precisely 10 feet away, and spoke with a voice that carried despite the wind trying to steal it. Duke Thornwell, I'm told you and my father made an arrangement 15 years ago that I'm now meant to fulfill. So let's not pretend this is anything other than what it is. I'm collateral, your leverage, and we're both trapped in a contract neither of us chose. The courtyard went completely silent. Servants froze mid-motion, guards stopped breathing. Even the wind seemed to pause, waiting to see what happened when someone spoke truth that blunt, to a man known for crushing dissent like dead leaves. Kaedric studied her for a long moment, searching for cracks in the armor she'd clearly spent the journey constructing. Found none. Most people arrive at Ravenmarch and spend their first hour trying to flatter me into forgetting why they're here. I'm not most people, and I'm not interested in pretending fear is the same thing as respect. Seraphina's gaze didn't waver. My father's a coward who sold his daughter to avoid consequences for his own failures. You're a duke accused of murdering his last wife to consolidate power. Neither of those things requires flattery to acknowledge. Someone behind Kaedric made a small sound that might have been a suppressed gasp. Bold words for someone who just walked into a fortress controlled by a man you just called a murderer. If you wanted me dead, I'd already be dead. If you wanted me silent, you would have specified that in the contract. So I'm assuming you brought me here for a reason beyond decoration, which means honesty serves both of us better than whatever game other noble families play. Kaedric took 3 steps forward, closing the distance until he could see the way cold had turned her cheeks red, the way her hands remained perfectly still, despite temperatures that should have had her shaking. You're either very brave or very stupid. I haven't decided which yet. Neither. I'm someone who understands that surviving in your world requires being too useful to discard and too dangerous to ignore. Fear makes people predictable. I'd rather be surprising. For the first time in 2 years, Kaedric felt something other than rage or grief move through his chest. Interest. Not desire. Not attraction. Just the pure recognition that the woman standing before him wasn't going to shatter the first time reality pressed against whatever illusion she'd arrived with. Your chambers are in the east wing. Servants will show you the way. Dinner is at 8 in the main hall. Attendance is mandatory for anyone residing at Ravenmarch. Understood. And Lady Seraphina? He waited until she met his eyes again. Every noble family in this kingdom thinks they understand how to navigate power. Most of them are dead or bankrupt. The ones who survived learned very quickly that courage without intelligence is just suicide with better marketing. Don't confuse honesty with immunity. She smiled then, just slightly, and it was the kind of smile that suggested she knew exactly what he'd just said and had been counting on it. I appreciate the warning, Your Grace. I'll try not to die too obviously in your halls. It would reflect poorly on both of us. Then she turned and walked toward the entrance. Servants were holding open, silver velvet trailing across stone like a banner claiming territory she hadn't even been granted yet. Kaedric stood alone in the courtyard afterward, watching snow begin to fall again, covering everything in fresh layers of white that pretended yesterday's blood had never existed. Brennan appeared beside him, materializing from wherever old advisors materialized from when they wanted to deliver observations no one asked for. That went differently than expected. She's not what Vale described. No, she's significantly more dangerous. Brennan's voice carried decades of watching nobles destroy themselves through arrogance or ambition. A frightened girl would have been easy to control or ignore. A woman who walks into this situation refusing to pretend it's anything other than what it is, that's someone who'll either save you or finish what Valamont and Carlisle started. Or she's someone her father specifically chose because he knew a silent, obedient daughter would have been useless leverage against a duke everyone already thinks is a monster. Kaedric started walking toward the castle entrance. Either way, she's here now, and she'll adapt or she'll break. Everyone does eventually. And if she doesn't, Kaedric stopped at the threshold, looking back at the courtyard where Seraphina's footprints were already being covered by fresh snow. Then maybe breaking isn't the only option. Night settled over Ravenmarch like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Kaedric sat in his study again, 3 oil lamps burning against darkness that seemed to press against the windows like something living. Documents covered the desk, trade agreements, military reports, surveillance notes from Brennan's network of spies embedded throughout the Northern Territories. And the letter. The anonymous, unsigned letter claiming Elise had been murdered. He'd read it 40 times since morning. 3 sentences that had detonated everything he thought he understood about the past 2 years. Every reading revealed nothing new except that whoever wrote it wanted him to tear his own household apart, searching for answers. Which meant either they were telling the truth, and a murderer still walked Ravenmarch's halls, or they were lying, and this was part of the larger conspiracy to destroy him through psychological warfare instead of open combat. Both options ended the same way. Violence. A knock interrupted thoughts spiraling toward conclusions he wasn't ready to face. Enter. Brennan stepped inside, carrying a leather folder bound with cord, expression grim in lamplight. You're not going to like this. I haven't liked anything in 2 years. Don't stop now. The folder dropped onto the desk. Kaedric opened it, scanning handwritten reports from investigators who'd spent the last 48 hours quietly interviewing servants, guards, and staff members who'd been present during Elise's final days. Most of the testimony matched what he already knew. The Duchess had fallen ill suddenly. Fever spiked. Physicians had been summoned. Treatments attempted. And within 72 hours she was dead. Body cold in chambers that still smelled like lavender and medicines that hadn't worked. But 3 testimonies included details that made his jaw clench. A physician no one could identify had entered the Duchess's chambers the night before her condition worsened. 2 servants claimed they'd seen him leaving through a side entrance just before dawn, carrying a medical bag that hadn't been there when he arrived. And the head of household security from 2 years ago, a man named Thomas Garrett, who'd been reassigned to Border Patrol 6 months after Elise's death, had written a statement before disappearing. 3 weeks ago, claiming he'd been ordered to destroy certain records related to visitor logs from that period, ordered by someone inside the castle, someone with authority. Cedric looked up slowly. Where's Garrett now? Is she what? Dead. Found in a ravine outside the western perimeter. Officially ruled a riding accident. Unofficially? Unofficially, his horse was found 2 miles away, uninjured, and the body showed signs of strangulation before the fall. Brennan's voice went quiet. Someone didn't want him talking. The room temperature seemed to drop despite the fire burning in the hearth. Who had authority to order destruction of security records 2 years ago? Anyone at the rank of Lord Steward or higher. That includes myself, Captain Holt, the head physician, and the royal liaison who was stationed here during your negotiations in the south. Names: myself, Captain Marcus Holt, Dr. Simeon Graves, and Lord Chancellor Aldrich Thorne. Brennan paused. The same man who's now leading the Crown's investigation into your alleged involvement in the Duchess's death. Cedric's hands pressed flat against the desk, knuckles white. Aldrich was here when Elise died. He was, assigned as Crown representative to monitor the trade negotiations you were conducting with southern provinces. He had full access to the castle, the staff, and the Duchess during your absence. And now he's suddenly concerned about justice for her death. How perfectly fucking convenient. It gets worse. Brennan pulled another document from his coat. Financial records I acquired through less than official channels. Aldrich received payments totaling 40,000 gold marks from House Valamont and House Carlisle over the past 18 months, officially listed as consulting fees for territorial dispute mediation. Bribes. Bribes. Which means the man investigating you for murder is on the payroll of the same noble families accusing you. And he was present in this castle with unsupervised access during the exact window when someone poisoned your wife. Cedric stood slowly, moving to the window, staring out at darkness where snow continued falling, like the sky had forgotten how to stop. Somewhere in that darkness, answers existed. Somewhere in this castle, a murderer had spent 2 years watching him grieve while collecting payment for a job well done. And now they thought they could finish what they started by framing him for the very crime they'd committed. I want Aldrich under constant surveillance, he said quietly. No meetings without witnesses, no correspondence that isn't copied. And I want every servant who worked in the Duchess's wing 2 years ago brought back to Ravenmarch for questioning. Offer them money. Offer them protection. Offer them whatever it takes. That'll take weeks. And if Aldrich realizes what we're doing, then he'll panic, and panicked men make mistakes. Cedric turned back toward Brennan, eyes hard as the stone surrounding them. I spent 2 years thinking grief was just grief. Thinking her death was random tragedy I should have prevented by being here. But if someone murdered Elise deliberately, if they calculated her death as part of a strategy to weaken me politically and psychologically, then they underestimated what I'm capable of when someone takes something I actually loved. Your Grace, if you move too quickly without proof. Everyone wants proof. But proof is just another weapon that cuts both ways. Cedric's voice dropped to something dangerous. I don't need proof that would hold up in a royal court. I need to know who did this, and once I know, proof becomes irrelevant. Brennan studied him with the kind of look that came from watching too many men cross lines they couldn't uncross. There are laws, procedures, even for dukes, and laws protect people who believe in them. I stopped believing in laws the moment I realized the people writing them were the same ones paying bribes to cover up murder. Cedric moved back to the desk, staring at Elise's portrait on the wall. Find me the truth, Brennan, however long it takes, whatever it costs. Because when I find out who did this, the only law that'll matter is the one that says I get to decide what justice looks like inside my own fortress. The old advisor left without another word, understanding when argument became pointless. Alone again, Cedric stood in the study surrounded by evidence of conspiracies that stretched back years, feeling control slip further away with every answer that raised 3 new questions. He'd built his entire life around the principle that power meant protection, that if you were strong enough, ruthless enough, prepared enough, You could keep the people you loved safe from a world that consumed weakness, like wolves consuming wounded deer. But Elise had died anyway, in his home, under his protection. While he was negotiating trade agreements that didn't matter compared to the 68 hours she'd spent dying in chambers he'd promised would always be sanctuary. The question that haunted him wasn't who murdered her anymore. The question was how many people needed to die before that debt was paid in full. Outside, wind howled. Inside, shadows moved across walls like memories refusing to disappear. And somewhere in the castle, a woman named Seraphina Vale was settling into chambers where the previous occupant had been poisoned by someone still breathing Ravenmarch's air, walking its halls, pretending loyalty while waiting for the perfect moment to finish what they'd started. The dining hall stretched vast and cold beneath iron chandeliers that swayed slightly in drafts no one could locate. Kedrick sat at the head of the table, positioned where his father had sat and his grandfather before that, every Duke of Ravenmarch occupying the same chair for 140 years, like the seat itself carried some kind of territorial claim that passed through bloodlines. Seraphina entered exactly on time, silver dress replaced by deep emerald that made her look like winter forest given human form. She walked the length of the hall without hesitation, ignoring the empty chairs closer to the door, taking the seat directly across from Kedrick at the opposite end where the last duchess had sat before fever and poison had emptied it permanently. Bold choice, or stupid one. Time would tell which. Servants moved between them, placing dishes that steamed in cold air, roasted venison and root vegetables that had survived winter storage, bread still warm from ovens that never stopped burning. Normal food for a dinner that felt anything but normal. Kedrick cut into meat without looking up. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, which was exactly the point. Most nobles couldn't tolerate silence. They filled it with nervous conversation or performative politeness, revealing more in their discomfort than any interrogation could extract. Seraphina ate calmly, knife and fork moving with practiced efficiency, eyes occasionally lifting to study the tapestries covering stone walls. Battle scenes, mostly. Thornwell ancestors crushing rebellions or negotiating surrenders that looked suspiciously like executions with better documentation. 5 minutes passed before she spoke. So you bring women into your fortress and then refuse to acknowledge they exist. Interesting strategy. Kedrick's jaw tightened slightly. I'm determining whether you're worth acknowledging. She set down her fork with deliberate care. And what have you determined so far? That you're either fearless or performing fearlessness well enough that the difference doesn't matter yet. He finally looked up, meeting her eyes across the distance. Most people in your position spend their first dinner trying to make themselves smaller, less threatening, easier to ignore. I'm not most people. You already know that, or you wouldn't have let me sit in the dead Duchess's chair without correcting the presumption. The temperature in the hall dropped another degree. Servants near the walls suddenly became very interested in not existing loudly enough to be noticed. Careful. You're testing boundaries you don't understand yet. Then explain them. Seraphina leaned forward slightly. You're the Duke everyone fears. I'm the daughter no one wanted. We're both trapped in a contract that benefits my coward father more than either of us. So let's stop pretending there's some elaborate game being played here. You tell me what you actually want from this arrangement, and I'll tell you whether I'm capable of providing it. Kedrick studied her for a long moment, searching for cracks in composure that seemed too solid for someone barely 20 years old. What I want is for noble families to stop using my dead wife's memory as leverage for their political ambitions. What I want is to find out who murdered the woman I loved while I was gone negotiating agreements that didn't save her. What I want is to burn down everything that pretends to be civilization while operating like organized violence wrapped in velvet ceremony. He paused, letting the words settle like stones dropped into dark water. But what I'll accept is you staying out of my way while I do what needs doing. You'll attend necessary functions. You'll perform whatever role your father's contract demands. And you'll avoid asking questions about things that'll get you killed before you're useful enough to justify the protection keeping you alive. Seraphina didn't flinch. That's the most honest thing anyone said to me in 5 years. Honesty is a luxury afforded to people who've stopped caring about consequences. He returned to cutting meat. You should be careful around it. She smiled then, sharp and brief like light reflecting off a blade. My father sold me to save his own fortune. My mother died when I was 12. I spent 8 years watching our house collapse while nobles circled like vultures waiting to claim whatever pieces remained valuable. I learned very early that the only safety in this world comes from being too expensive to discard and too dangerous to control completely. Kaedric's hand paused mid-motion. Dangerous is a strong word for someone who arrived here with barely enough guards to protect against bandits. Dangerous doesn't require swords. Sometimes it just requires watching powerful men long enough to understand what they're actually afraid of. And what am I afraid of? Her eyes held his without blinking. That someone will see past the ruthless Duke performance and realize you're just a man who loved his wife and doesn't know how to stop grieving without dismantling everything that reminds him she existed. The silence that followed could have cut stone. Servants stopped moving entirely. Even the fire in the massive hearth seemed to quiet, flames flickering uncertainly. Kaedric stood slowly, chair scraping against floor like a sentence being pronounced. You know nothing about my wife. I know she died in this castle while you were gone. I know you've spent 2 years convincing yourself that control equals protection. And if you're just strong enough, ruthless enough, prepared enough, you can prevent loss through pure force of will. Seraphina stood as well, voice steady despite the danger radiating across the table. I know that because I did the same thing after my mother died. I tried to save our house through strategy and careful calculation, and pretending fear was just weakness that could be eliminated through discipline. She stepped away from her chair, hands at her sides, no defensive posture. It doesn't work. Grief isn't something you conquer, it's something you survive. And the longer you try to wage war against it, the more you become exactly what your enemies claim you are. Get out. Excuse me. Get out of this hall before I forget that killing you would complicate situations I don't have time to uncomplicate right now. Seraphina held his gaze for 3 more seconds, long enough to communicate that she was leaving by choice, not command, then turned and walked toward the exit with the same unhurried pace she'd used entering. The doors closed behind her with a sound like finality. Kaedric remained standing at the head of the table, surrounded by half-eaten food and the kind of silence that followed detonations. His hands pressed against wood hard enough to make knuckles go white, breath coming faster than it should. She was wrong. Had to be wrong. Because if she was right, if everything he'd built over the past 2 years was just elaborate defense against feeling something he couldn't control, then what the hell had any of it been for? Brennan materialized from wherever shadows kept old advisors when they weren't needed immediately, voice quiet enough not to shatter whatever remained of Kaedric's composure. That was illuminating. She's dangerous. Yes, but not in the way you're suggesting. Brennan moved closer, age-spotted hands folded behind his back. Dangerous would be someone trying to manipulate you. She's simply refusing to pretend she doesn't see what everyone else pretends doesn't exist. I don't pay you for psychological analysis. You don't pay me at all. I serve because your father asked me to, and because someone needs to tell you when you're about to make catastrophic mistakes. Brennan paused. The girl isn't your enemy. But treating her like one because she spoke truth you didn't want to hear will drive her toward people who are. Kaedric turned sharply. Are you suggesting I trust someone whose father sold her as leverage? I'm suggesting you recognize that being sold as leverage gives her every reason to hate the system that treats women like currency, which means she might be the only person in this castle with motivations that don't involve using you for advancement or destroying you for profit. What are her motivations then? Survival. Same as yours. She's just honest about what survival costs. The old advisor left before Kaedric could formulate a response worth delivering. Alone again in the vast hall, surrounded by portraits of ancestors who'd probably faced similar moments and made similar mistakes, Kaedric felt something crack in the foundation he'd been building for 2 years. Not collapse, just crack. Hairline fracture that suggested maybe the whole structure wasn't as stable as he'd convinced himself it needed to be. Elise had called him out the same way once. Early in their marriage, after he'd spent 3 days locked in his study following a failed negotiation that cost 12 men their lives. She'd walked in without permission, closed the door, and told him that punishing himself wouldn't resurrect the dead, and leadership sometimes meant accepting that good decisions still produce terrible outcomes. He'd wanted to throw her out then, too. Instead, he'd broken down completely, grief and rage and guilt pouring out like poison from an infected wound. And she'd stayed. Hadn't tried to fix it, hadn't offered empty comfort. Just stayed while he shattered against the reality that power didn't prevent loss and control was mostly illusion dressed in expensive clothes. Seraphina had that same quality. That refusal to look away from things everyone else pretended weren't happening, which made her either the most valuable person in Ravenmarch or the most dangerous threat to everything he was trying to build? Possibly both. 3 days passed like slow violence. Cedric buried himself in interrogations and investigations, pulling every servant who'd been present during Elise's final days back to the castle for questioning that ranged from polite inquiry to barely concealed threat. Most remembered nothing useful. Some remembered details that contradicted other details. All of them were terrified enough that extracting truth from performance became nearly impossible. Brennan's network produced more evidence of Aldrich Thorne's financial connections to House Valamont and House Carlisle. Payments that lined up suspiciously with key political moves against Ravenmarch's interests over the past 2 years. Trade routes that collapsed, military supply contracts that vanished, border disputes that erupted exactly when Cedric's attention was divided elsewhere. Pattern suggested coordination, but pattern wasn't proof. And without proof that would survive royal scrutiny, moving against a crown emissary meant civil war, which was starting to look inevitable anyway. Seraphina had made no attempt to seek him out since the dinner confrontation. Servants reported she spent most days in the castle library, reading histories of the northern territories and documents related to trade law. At night, she walked the eastern ramparts despite cold that should have driven anyone indoors, staring out at frozen sea and darkness, like she was measuring distance to freedom that didn't exist. Captain Holt mentioned guards were starting to speculate about why the Duke's contracted bride lived in the castle but never appeared at his side for any formal function. Rumors spread that maybe she'd been brought here to die like the last Duchess, that maybe Cedric was waiting for the right moment to eliminate another political obstacle. Brennan suggested addressing the speculation before it metastasized into something more dangerous. Cedric ignored the suggestion until the evening a messenger arrived from the capital carrying sealed orders from the crown. He opened them in his study while Brennan watched with the expression of someone who already knew the contents wouldn't be good. The royal seal cracked under his thumb. Parchment unfolded, revealing formal language that barely concealed threat underneath. Duke Cedric Thornwell of Ravenmarch was hereby commanded to appear before the Royal Council within 14 days to answer formal charges related to suspected involvement in the death of Duchess Elise Thornwell. Failure to comply would result in suspension of all ducal authority and seizure of territorial holdings pending resolution of the investigation. The letter continued with legal terminology that essentially meant he was being summoned for a trial disguised as inquiry, where the verdict had already been negotiated by the same noble families paying bribes to ensure his conviction. Brennan spoke quietly. "They're forcing your hand. Either you go to the capital and face a rigged tribunal, or you refuse and they use that refusal as evidence of guilt. Neither option includes me actually being innocent. Innocence stopped mattering the moment Aldrich accepted payment from your enemies." The old advisor moved closer. "You have 2 weeks. That's enough time to what? Prove a conspiracy that reaches into the crown's own administration. Expose bribes and forge testimony, while the people judging me are the same ones who profit from my removal." He crumpled the parchment slowly. "They've already won, Brennan. The trial is just ceremony before execution. Then you need to change the game entirely. Meaning you stop defending against accusations and start attacking the system that's weaponizing them." Brennan's voice hardened with something that sounded almost like anger. "You have resources, influence, military strength, information on every corrupt official between here and the capital. Use it. Make them more afraid of what you'll reveal than they are excited about what they'll gain from destroying you. That's treason. That's survival." Brennan leaned against the desk. "You think the crown cares about justice. The crown cares about stability, and right now, House Valamont and House Carlisle have convinced them that removing you creates more stability than protecting you. So convince them otherwise. Show them that a fallen Ravenmarch produces chaos expensive enough to make your continued existence the cheaper option." Cedric stared at the crumpled letter, mind cycling through scenarios that all ended in violence or exile, or watching everything his family built get dismantled by opportunists who'd barely survived their own incompetence. How do I convince the crown that chaos is expensive without actually creating chaos? You start by making it very clear what information you possess, and what happens if that information becomes public. Brennan pulled another folder from his coat. Complete financial records of bribes paid to 17 crown officials over the past decade. Trade violations by 6 noble houses, including detailed manifests. Evidence of 3 assassination contracts ordered by families currently sitting on the royal council. He dropped it on the desk with enough weight to make the wood groan. You leak even a fraction of this, and half the peerage goes down in flames. The crown can't afford that kind of instability. So you make them understand that protecting you protects their own survival. That's blackmail. That's negotiation from a position of strength instead of defending from a position of weakness. Brennan's eyes were hard as flint. You asked me to find truth about who killed Elise. I found it. Aldrich Thorne coordinated with Valamont and Carlisle to have her poisoned specifically to break you psychologically while weakening your political position. They gambled you'd either collapse into grief or lash out violently, giving them justification to move against you openly. Caedric's vision narrowed to a point somewhere beyond the walls. Where's your proof? The physician who administered the poison. His name was Dr. Simeon Graves. He disappeared 6 months after the Duchess died, but my people found him living under false identity in a southern port town. He confessed everything before dying from injuries sustained during questioning. How convenient that he died before providing testimony. His confession was recorded, signed, witnessed. Brennan pulled a final document from his coat. Everything you need to prove Aldrich ordered the murder. Everything you need to destroy the families who paid for it. The paper felt heavier than it should. Caedric read it slowly, each line confirming what he'd suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. That his wife had died not from random tragedy, but calculated assassination. That people he'd negotiated with, dined with, tolerated for years had conspired to murder the one person he'd allowed himself to love. That grief wasn't something that had happened to him. It was something that had been deliberately inflicted as a weapon. When he looked up, his eyes were dead calm. Where's Aldrich now? Still in the capital, preparing his case for the tribunal. Get him back to Ravenmarch. I don't care what excuse you manufacture. Tell him I'm ready to cooperate. Tell him I'll provide full access to records he requested. Whatever it takes to get him inside these walls before the trial date. You're going to kill him. I'm going to make him confess. There's a difference. Not much of one. Caedric stood, moving to the window, staring out at darkness that matched what was moving through his chest. For 2 years I played by their rules. I answered their questions. I tolerated their accusations. I tried to prove innocence to people who'd already decided guilt was more profitable. And it got me nothing except a trial designed to justify the verdict they purchased before the investigation even started. He turned back toward Brennan, voice dropping to something cold and final. I'm done defending. I'm done negotiating. They wanted the ruthless Duke everyone whispers about in locked rooms. So I'll give them exactly what they paid for. And when this is over, everyone will understand that killing someone I loved wasn't a successful strategy. It was the mistake that cost them everything. Book. Seraphina discovered the library's restricted section on her 4th day in Ravenmarch. Hidden behind a false bookcase in the eastern wing, accessible only through a panel that required specific volumes to be pulled in sequence. She'd found the pattern by accident while researching territorial law and noticed books that didn't quite match the shelving system everyone else followed. Inside, documents that no duke had wanted destroyed, but every duke had wanted hidden, correspondence revealing decades of political manipulation. Records of assassinations ordered and executed. Financial ledgers showing bribes paid to crown officials in rival houses. Everything needed to understand how Ravenmarch had survived as an independent power while kingdoms around it collapsed into infighting and bankruptcy. She sat cross-legged on cold stone floor, reading by candlelight that flickered uncertainly, learning the history of the fortress she'd been sold into, like it was a language she'd been forced to speak without understanding its grammar. The Thornwell family had built their power not through honorable leadership or noble virtue, but through ruthless pragmatism that treated morality as luxury, affordable only to people who didn't need to survive. They'd eliminated threats before threats materialized. They'd crushed resistance before resistance organized. They'd made examples brutal enough that rebellion became suicidal rather than heroic. And it had worked for 150 years, until someone decided the current duke had become more dangerous than useful and needed to be broken before being eliminated. Footsteps echoed in the main library beyond the hidden door. Seraphina froze, hand moving instinctively toward the knife she'd started carrying after the first dinner with Caedric. Not that a blade would help against trained guards, but having it made the vulnerability slightly more bearable. The false bookcase swung open, revealing not guards, but Caedric himself, standing in the entrance with expression that suggested he'd known exactly where to find her. Breaking into restricted sections. Bold choice for someone who's supposed to be avoiding attention. I wasn't breaking in. The door was already open. The door requires a 6-book sequence to unlock. You either guessed it perfectly, or you're significantly better at pattern recognition than your father's reputation suggested. She stood slowly, brushing dust from her dress. Maybe I'm good at seeing systems other people think are invisible. Or maybe you're a spy sent by your father to gather information that makes me vulnerable to whatever moves House Valamon is planning next. He stepped inside, closing the panel behind him. The temperature in the small room dropped as his presence filled the space. What have you learned? That your family stayed in power by being more terrifying than any alternative. That the current conspiracy against you isn't new, it's just the latest version of attempts that have been happening for decades. And that whoever murdered your wife understood the only way to weaken Ravenmarch was to break the Duke personally before attacking politically. Kedrick's jaw tightened. You read that in historical records. I read enough to understand the pattern. The rest I figured out by watching how servants behave around you. Fear mixed with loyalty. Which means you're dangerous, but not indiscriminately cruel. That's the kind of reputation that survives only when violence serves purpose instead of pleasure. She moved slightly, putting the table between them. Not defense, exactly. Just awareness that close quarters with a man who radiated controlled fury wasn't strategic. I also figured out you brought me here not because you care about my father's contract, but because having me visible inside Ravenmarch forces your enemies to account for another variable. If I disappear or die mysteriously, it confirms the accusations they're making. If I survive and appear comfortable, it complicates their narrative. I'm political insurance disguised as arranged marriage. Kedrick studied her for a long moment. You're smarter than you needed to be. Survival requires being smarter than circumstances demand. She met his eyes directly. So let's stop dancing around what we both know. You're about to do something that crosses lines you can't uncross. Something violent enough that it'll either end the conspiracy against you or turn you into exactly what they claim you are. And you're trying to decide whether I'm going to be a liability or an asset when that moment comes. The silence stretched thin and dangerous. Finally, Kedrick spoke, voice quiet but edged like broken glass. In 2 days, Lord Aldrich Thorne arrives at Ravenmarch under the impression I'm cooperating with the royal investigation. What he doesn't know is I have proof he coordinated with House Valamont and House Carlisle to have my wife murdered. Proof that would destroy not just him, but a dozen noble families and half the crown's administration if it became public. He's walking into a fortress where the man he tried to break is waiting with evidence of his crimes and no remaining interest in legal procedure. Seraphina absorbed that information without visible reaction. You're going to torture him until he confesses. I'm going to give him the opportunity to confess before torture becomes necessary. Kedrick's tone suggested he didn't believe that opportunity would be accepted. Either way, by the end of the week, everyone will know who ordered Elise's death, and what happens to people who think murder is acceptable political strategy. That'll start a war. War is already coming. This just determines whether I fight from a position of moral authority or desperate vengeance. There's no moral authority in torture and execution. There's survival. Everything else is philosophy, affordable only to people who don't have enemies willing to poison their wives. He moved closer, eliminating the distance she'd tried to maintain. You asked what I want from you. This is it. When Aldrich arrives, you'll attend dinners and functions like the contracted bride you're supposed to be. You'll sit beside me during interrogations. You'll watch what happens when someone crosses lines they thought were protected by law and custom. Why? So I understand what kind of monster I'm contractually bound to. So you understand that monsters are just people who've been pushed past the point where civilization's rules still apply. He stopped close enough that she could see scars on his knuckles from fights that predated his title. Everyone thinks power is what makes men dangerous, but power is just resources. What makes men dangerous is deciding that survival matters more than the performance of being good. And if I refuse to participate in your demonstration, then you'll spend the rest of this arrangement locked in chambers while I do what needs doing. But you won't refuse. You sound very certain. You're still standing here asking questions instead of running. That tells me everything I need to know about whether you're capable of witnessing what comes next. Seraphina held his gaze, pulse hammering but voice steady. I watched my mother die slowly from illness. My father couldn't afford to treat properly because he'd gambled away our fortune. I watched our servants disappear one by one as we sold everything to pay debts. I watched noble families who'd pretended friendship for years turn their backs the moment we stopped being useful. So don't assume I'm fragile just because I haven't personally ordered executions. I don't assume you're fragile. I assume you're calculating whether aligning yourself with what I'm about to do serves your survival better than opposing it. She smiled without humor. There's hope for us yet. The tension broke slightly, not dissolving but shifting into something almost resembling understanding. Two people trapped in circumstances neither chose, trying to survive systems designed to consume anyone who stopped performing submission or strength convincingly enough. Kaedric stepped back, creating space again. The interrogation happens in the lower chambers, stone walls thick enough that sound doesn't carry. Aldrich will arrive believing he's in control of the situation. That confidence will make the reversal more complete. How poetic, practical. Fear is most effective when it replaces certainty suddenly enough that there's no time to adapt. He moved toward the exit. Be ready, and understand that once this starts, there's no diplomatic resolution, no negotiation, just consequences delivered to people who thought they were insulated from them. The panel swung shut behind him, leaving Seraphina alone again in the restricted library surrounded by evidence that the current crisis was just the latest chapter in a story that had been written in blood and calculated cruelty for generations. She returned to reading, but the words on the pages felt different now. Less like history and more like instruction manual for surviving a world where power and violence were just different languages describing the same fundamental truth. The kingdoms built on law only functioned as long as someone was willing to enforce that law through methods the law itself would condemn. States. Aldrich Thorne arrived at Ravenmarch with an entourage that included 2 crown officials, 6 guards, and enough formal documentation to stock a small library. He entered the castle with the confidence of a man who believed royal authority provided immunity from consequences and political connections provided insurance against retaliation. Kaedric watched from the upper gallery as servants took their coats and weapons, as guards were directed toward guest quarters, as Aldrich's eyes swept across the main hall, cataloging details for reports he'd never get to file. Brennan appeared beside him like smoke taking shape. Everything is prepared. Lower chambers are secure. Physician is standing by in case the interrogation requires medical intervention to keep him alive long enough to provide useful information. Kaedric nodded without speaking, jaw tight enough to make temples ache. 2 years of grief and fury and carefully maintained control were about to detonate into violence that would either justify everything his enemies claimed or prove that sometimes monsters were just people who'd been murdered first and decided resurrection required destroying everyone responsible. What about the girl? Brennan's voice carried something almost like concern. She's in her chambers. I sent word you wanted her present for dinner. She'll come. You're certain. She's too curious to stay away. And she understands that witnessing this either makes her complicit or makes her dangerous. Either way, she needs to choose. The old advisor studied him carefully. You're using her as a test, to see if she's capable of surviving what you're becoming. I'm giving her the same choice everyone else gets. Adapt or leave. There's no third option in Ravenmarch. Below, Aldrich was laughing at something a servant had said, perfectly at ease in a fortress where the man he'd tried to destroy was watching him like prey that didn't know it was already dead. The dinner bell rang through stone corridors, calling everyone to the hall where meals had been served for 150 years, where dukes had made decisions and delivered judgments, and sometimes confused the two until distinction didn't matter anymore. Kaedric descended the stairs slowly, each step deliberate, arriving in the hall exactly as Aldrich took his seat near the head of the table. The crown emissary smiled, standing politely as the duke approached. Your Grace, thank you for agreeing to this meeting. I know the circumstances are difficult, but cooperation will make the process considerably smoother for everyone involved. I'm sure it will. Kaedric took his chair at the head of the table, watching servants arrange dishes with practiced efficiency. Where are your officials? I was told you brought crown representation. They're settling into quarters. I thought perhaps you and I could discuss preliminary matters privately before formal proceedings begin. Thoughtful, but unnecessary. The hall doors opened and Seraphina entered, wearing midnight blue that made her look carved from shadow, hair pulled back severe enough to seem like statement. She moved directly to the chair beside Kaedric, sitting without asking permission, eyes fixed on Aldrich with expression that revealed nothing. Lord Aldrich, I'm told you're here to investigate my future husband for crimes he didn't commit, while ignoring crimes committed by people who paid you to conduct this investigation. How noble. Aldrich's smile froze slightly. Lady Seraphina, I wasn't aware you'd be joining us. Surprises seemed to be common this evening. She accepted wine from a servant without looking away from the emissary. Tell me, how much did House Valamont and House Carlisle pay for your loyalty? I'm curious whether crown officials are expensive or if you're just particularly affordable. The temperature in the hall plummeted. Servants near the walls became statues. Guards stationed at the doors shifted weight unconsciously toward weapons they weren't permitted to draw inside the Duke's presence during formal dinners. Aldrich's face flushed. I don't know what you're implying, but I'm not implying anything. She sipped wine calmly. I'm stating that you accepted 40,000 gold marks in bribes over 18 months to coordinate false accusations against Duke Thornwell while covering up evidence that you personally facilitated the murder of Duchess Elise 2 years ago. The silence that followed could have stopped hearts. Aldrich stood abruptly, chair scraping. This is absurd. I came here under diplomatic immunity to conduct legitimate crown business. And sit down. Caedric's voice cut through rising panic like blade through skin. 2 words delivered so quietly they barely qualified as sound, but every person in the hall felt them like physical force. Aldrich remained standing, face pale, eyes darting toward doors where guards had moved to block exits. I said, sit down. The emissary sank back into his chair like strings had been cut, survival instinct overriding whatever protest his mind was trying to formulate. Caedric leaned forward slightly, hands folded on the table, expression carved from stone that remembered every execution it had witnessed. You came to Ravenmarch 2 years ago as crown representative monitoring trade negotiations. You had full access to this castle, to my staff, to my wife while I was negotiating agreements in the south. And during that time, you coordinated with House Valamont and House Carlisle to have Duchess Elise poisoned specifically to break me psychologically before moving against me politically. There was a physician, Dr. Simeon Graves. You hired him. You provided him access. You supervised the administration of poison designed to mimic winter fever while ensuring no one suspected foul play. He confessed everything before dying, named you specifically, provided details about payments and communications, and the precise method used to ensure the Duchess's death appeared natural. Aldrich's breathing accelerated into something close to hyperventilation. His confession wouldn't hold up in any royal court. Testimony extracted under duress is the same testimony you intended to use against me during the tribunal. Caedric's voice stayed perfectly level, which somehow made it worse. Forged evidence, paid witnesses, manufactured accusations. You gambled that a grieving duke would either collapse or lash out violently, giving you justification to move against Ravenmarch openly. He stood slowly, moving around the table with predatory patience. What you didn't account for was the possibility I'd discover the truth, that I'd find proof, that I'd wait until you felt safe enough to walk back into the fortress where you murdered my wife, and personally deliver you to consequences you thought crown immunity would prevent. Aldrich's eyes went wide. You can't touch me. I'm under royal protection. Royal protection exists as long as the crown believes protecting you costs less than exposing your crimes. Caedric stopped behind the emissary's chair. But I have documentation proving you coordinated the murder of a duchess, accepted bribes from noble houses conspiring against crown interests, and falsified evidence in a royal investigation. The moment that information becomes public, you stop being a protected official and start being a liability the crown will sacrifice to maintain stability. So here's what happens next. He leaned down slightly, voice dropping to something intimate and terrible. You're going to be escorted to the lower chambers. You're going to provide detailed confession naming everyone involved in my wife's murder. And you're going to sign documentation affirming that testimony was given voluntarily without coercion. Do that, and you'll live long enough to stand trial before the crown you served so poorly. Refuse, and I'll extract the same information through methods that make what happened to Dr. Graves look merciful by comparison. Aldrich's voice came out as whisper. You're insane. No. I'm done pretending law protects people who use it as weapon while ignoring its constraints themselves. Caedric straightened, nodding toward guards who moved forward with mechanical efficiency. Take him below. Begin questioning when the physician confirms he's stable enough to survive it. They hauled Aldrich from his chair while he screamed protests about diplomatic immunity and royal authority and consequences that would rain down on Ravenmarch like divine judgment. The hall doors closed behind them with finality that sounded like tomb sealing. Seraphina sat perfectly still, wineglass halfway to her lips, expression revealing nothing except perhaps calculation. She waited until the last echo of Aldrich's screams faded before speaking. You planned this entire dinner as psychological torture before the actual torture begins. Opening moves determine whether the rest of the game requires subtlety or just overwhelming force. Cedric returned to his seat, exhausted suddenly in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. He chose to murder Elise because he thought breaking me emotionally would make controlling me politically easier. So yes, I wanted him to understand exactly how catastrophic that miscalculation was before extracting details about everyone else involved. And you wanted me here to witness it. I wanted you to understand what survival looks like when civilization's rules stop applying. He met her eyes across the table. You asked what kind of man I am. Now you know. The question is whether you're capable of existing in the same fortress as someone willing to cross every line that matters when the alternative is letting the people who murdered his wife walk away unpunished. Seraphina set down her glass carefully. My mother died because my father wouldn't pay for treatments that might have saved her. He chose preserving wealth over preserving his wife's life. And when she was gone, he spent years pretending grief while gambling away everything she'd wanted protected. She stood, moving toward the exit with measured steps. So when you ask if I'm capable of existing alongside someone willing to cross lines for the people they love, understand that I spent 8 years wishing my father had been that person. At least your wife mattered enough to you that her death demands consequences. Some of us weren't that fortunate. The doors closed behind her, leaving Cedric alone in a hall that suddenly felt vast and empty, despite all the furniture and history weighing down the space. Below the castle, in chambers built specifically for extracting truth from people who'd spent lifetimes learning how to lie convincingly, Aldrich Thorne was discovering that immunity was just a word powerful men used until they met someone more powerful who'd stopped caring about words entirely. And somewhere in the East Wing, a woman who'd been sold as collateral was learning that choosing survival sometimes meant witnessing the exact moment when the person you'd been aligned with stopped being human and started being the weapon everyone had always feared they'd become. There was no going back from this. Not for Cedric. Not for Seraphina. Not for anyone involved in the conspiracy that had killed a duchess and thought consequences were negotiable. The only question remaining was how many people would die before the debt was paid, and whether paying it would leave anything worth saving when the violence finally stopped. The screaming stopped around midnight. Cedric stood in the corridor outside the interrogation chamber, stone walls thick enough to muffle sound but not eliminate it entirely. For 6 hours, Aldrich Thorne had alternated between defiance and begging, between threats of royal retribution and offers of cooperation that came too late to matter. The physician had intervened twice to prevent death from shock or blood loss, administering treatments that kept the emissary conscious enough to continue providing names and details that painted a conspiracy deeper and more coordinated than even Brennan's intelligence network had uncovered. Captain Holt emerged from the chamber, face expressionless in the way only career soldiers managed when their hands were covered in someone else's blood. He held a leather folder bound with cord, pages filled with confession written in shaking script that deteriorated as hours passed and pain accumulated beyond what human bodies were designed to endure. He signed everything. Named 17 nobles directly involved in planning the Duchess's murder, provided payment schedules, identified the poison used and how it was administered. Holt's voice carried no emotion. Medical staff says he'll survive long enough to stand trial if we get him to the capital within 3 days. Good. Cedric took the folder without opening it. Make sure Crown officials with his entourage witness his condition. Let them see exactly what happens to people who think diplomatic immunity insulates them from consequences when they murder duchesses inside fortresses built to withstand sieges. Sir, those officials will report this to the Crown immediately. They'll frame it as torture of a royal emissary conducted without legal authority. Then they'll report accurately. Let the Crown decide whether prosecuting me for extracting a confession serves their interests better than prosecuting the nobles Aldrich just implicated in conspiracy and murder. He turned toward the stairs leading back to inhabited sections of the castle. Either way, the truth is documented now. That changes everything. Holt hesitated, which was unusual enough to make Cedric stop and look back. Sir, the confession includes allegations about Lord Brennan Vale. Impossible. Brennan served my family for 40 years. According to Aldrich, Lord Brennan received payments from House Valamont starting 8 months before the Duchess's death. Not large amounts, just enough to ensure certain information reached the right people at the right time. Holt's jaw tightened. He claims Brennan provided details about your travel schedule, security protocols, and the Duchess's daily routines. Intelligence that made the assassination possible. The corridor seemed to tilt slightly. Kedrick's hand pressed against cold stone, steadying himself against vertigo that had nothing to do with physical imbalance. Aldrich is lying, trying to sow discord by implicating someone he knows I trust. Maybe, but he provided specific dates and amounts that can be verified. And he knew details about the security failure that allowed the physician access to the Duchess's chambers. Details only someone inside your household would possess. Where is Brennan now? In his quarters, preparing reports on the interrogation for royal officials. Confine him there. Post guards outside his door. No one enters or leaves until I've verified every detail of Aldrich's claims. Holt nodded once and disappeared down the corridor, boots echoing against stone that had witnessed 1,000 betrayals and would witness 1,000 more before these walls finally crumbled into the sea below. Kedrick remained motionless, folder pressed against his chest like shield against realization that wanted to destroy what little foundation remained. Brennan had been his father's most trusted advisor, had guided Kedrick through the transition to Duke when the old man died, had provided counsel during negotiations and marriages and decisions that shaped territories and futures, had been present in the castle when Elise died, had supervised the reassignment of servants who might have witnessed something important, had controlled information flow during the investigation that followed her death. The possibility that someone so integral to Ravenmarch's functioning could have been corrupted, could have facilitated the murder of a woman he'd claimed to respect and protect, felt like discovering the fortress walls were constructed from sand and lies instead of stone and blood. But possibility wasn't proof. And Kedrick had spent 2 years learning that the difference between those concepts determined whether justice served truth or simply served whoever paid for verdicts in advance. He climbed stairs toward inhabited sections of the castle, passing servants who pressed themselves against walls as he approached, eyes downcast in the universal language of people trying to become invisible around predators. The main hall stood empty except for dying firelight and shadows that moved wrong, cast by flames that flickered uncertainly in drafts no one could explain. Seraphina sat in one of the high-backed chairs near the hearth, book open in her lap, but eyes focused on nothing, staring at darkness beyond windows that reflected the hall back at itself like accusation. She looked up as he approached, face illuminated by firelight that made her seem carved from the same stone as everything else in this place. She closed the book slowly, hands resting on leather binding. Is he still alive? Barely, but alive enough to provide confession implicating half the Northern peerage in conspiracy and murder. Kedrick moved to the chair opposite hers, exhaustion settling into bones like poison. You should be in your chambers. It's past midnight. I couldn't sleep. She studied him with expression that might have been concern or calculation, or both. Does getting the truth you wanted feel like victory? Victory would require believing the truth stops at Aldrich. That confession is just the beginning of discovering how deep corruption runs through systems I thought I understood. How deep does it run? Deep enough that my most trusted advisor might have been taking bribes to facilitate my wife's murder while pretending loyalty for 40 years. He leaned back, closing his eyes against light that hurt suddenly. Deep enough that I can't trust anyone inside these walls to tell me who else might be compromised. Seraphina said nothing for a long moment. Then, quietly, "You're not seriously considering that Lord Brennan betrayed you. I'm considering that a man under extreme duress provided specific allegations with verifiable details about someone positioned to have done exactly what he claims. Whether those allegations are true or strategic lies designed to fracture my remaining support structure doesn't change the fact they exist now. And existence creates doubt. Doubt creates paralysis. Paralysis creates vulnerability. So what will you do? Investigate. Verify. And if proof confirms Brennan sold information that got Elise killed, then I'll treat him the same way I treated everyone else responsible, even though he's served your family since before you were born, especially because of that." Kedrick opened his eyes, meeting her gaze directly. Betrayal from strangers is expected. Betrayal from people you trust enough to defend your life and your family's legacy is the kind that destroys foundations. If Brennan is guilty, the mercy he receives for decades of service is dying quickly instead of slowly. That's the only loyalty remaining. You sound like you've already decided he's guilty. I sound like someone who spent 2 years believing grief was just grief, only to discover it was weaponized trauma inflicted by people who gambled I'd collapse instead of investigate. She studied his face like reading document written in language only partially understood. I watched my father destroy our family through cowardice and bad decisions. But he never pretended to be something other than weak. Your situation is worse because the people destroying you wear masks of loyalty and service while counting gold paid for your wife's murder. That's a bleak perspective. That's an accurate perspective. Power attracts two types of people: those who want to wield it and those who want to profit from proximity to it. Your father probably understood that distinction. You seem surprised by it. My father trusted Brennan completely. Your father might have been wrong. Or Brennan might have been trustworthy then and compromised later when House Valamont offered enough gold to make betrayal rational. People change when survival requires it. She set the book aside. The question is whether you're capable of accepting that someone you loved and trusted could have facilitated the murder of someone else you loved and trusted. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Cadric stared at flames consuming wood with patient inevitability, wondering whether the fortress he'd inherited was actually a prison constructed by ancestors who'd mistaken isolation for protection and control for security. If Brennan is guilty, it means I've spent 2 years taking counsel from the man who helped murder my wife. That every decision I've made since her death was potentially influenced by someone working to ensure my destruction. That grief and rage and isolation weren't just natural responses, but engineered outcomes designed to make me predictable. And if discovering that breaks something fundamental in your ability to trust anyone ever again, Seraphina said quietly, then they've succeeded even if you execute everyone responsible. Because a duke who can't trust his own household eventually collapses under the weight of paranoia or makes mistakes that enemies exploit. Either way, Ravenmarch falls. Then what do you suggest? I suggest you verify before executing. Investigate thoroughly. Give Brennan opportunity to defend himself. And accept that uncertainty is part of survival. She stood, moving toward the exit. You wanted me to witness what you're capable of when lines get crossed. I watched. Now you need to decide whether capability requires constant demonstration or if strength sometimes means restraint even when fury demands violence. The doors closed behind her before he could formulate response worth delivering. Alone again in a hall that felt haunted by every duke who'd sat in this same chair facing similar decisions. About loyalty and betrayal, and whether foundations could survive discovering they'd been built on sand all along. Dawn arrived gray and reluctant, like even the sun had doubts about illuminating what daylight might reveal. Kedrick hadn't slept, had spent hours reviewing financial records Holt's people had seized from Brennan's quarters, cross-referencing dates and amounts against Aldrich's confession, searching for inconsistencies that would prove the allegations were fabricated attempts to create chaos during a moment of vulnerability. Found none. Every payment Aldrich described appeared in coded ledger entries Brennan had kept meticulously hidden behind false accounting that looked legitimate until examined closely. 40,000 gold marks over 18 months. Deposits that coincided exactly with intelligence failures that had benefited House Valamont and House Carlisle. Information about troop movements, trade negotiations, security protocols surrounding the Duchess's protection detail. Everything needed to ensure her assassination succeeded without evidence pointing toward conspiracy. Brennan had been selling Ravenmarch's secrets while sitting at council tables pretending wisdom and loyalty, had watched Caedric grieve for 2 years while collecting payment for facilitating that grief, had offered counsel about investigating Elise's death while ensuring investigation never discovered his involvement in causing it. The rage that moved through Caedric's chest felt different than what he'd experienced during Aldrich's interrogation. That had been fury directed at external enemies. This was something colder, more final. The kind of anger that came from discovering trust itself had been weaponized, and every foundation believed secure was actually trap waiting to collapse. He stood slowly, joints stiff from hours sitting motionless, and walked toward Brennan's quarters with the folder of evidence pressed against his side like blade waiting to be drawn. 2 guards stood outside the door, positioned there since Holt had confined the old advisor 12 hours earlier. They straightened as Caedric approached, but said nothing. Understanding silence was the appropriate response when their duke's expression suggested someone was about to die, and speaking might redirect that outcome toward themselves. Caedric pushed the door open without knocking. Brennan sat in a chair near the window, dressed in the same clothes from yesterday, silver hair disheveled in a way that suggested he'd spent the night exactly as Kaedric had. Awake, waiting, understanding something fundamental had shifted but uncertain what that shift would cost. He looked up as Kaedric entered, face lined with age and exhaustion and something that might have been resignation. Your Grace, I assume Captain Holt shared Lord Aldrich's allegations. He did, along with financial records from your quarters confirming every payment Aldrich described. Kaedric closed the door, eliminating any possibility of retreat or rescue. 40,000 gold marks. Dates matching security failures. Intelligence about my wife's routines and protection details. Everything someone would need to facilitate her assassination while ensuring the conspiracy remained hidden. Brennan's hands folded slowly in his lap, knuckles prominent against weathered skin. And you believe I betrayed you. I believe the evidence is compelling enough to demand explanation before I decide whether you die quickly or slowly. The old advisor nodded as though he'd expected exactly this response. I took the payments. All of them. Recorded carefully so I wouldn't lose track of how much House Valamont thought my betrayal was worth. The admission landed like physical blow. Some part of Kaedric had hoped for denial, for explanation revealing misunderstanding or manipulation or context that made the evidence mean something other than what it obviously meant. Instead, Brennan offered confirmation delivered with the calm of someone who'd been carrying weight too long and felt relief at finally setting it down. Why? Because your father destroyed my family to consolidate his power, and I spent 40 years waiting for the right moment to return that favor. Brennan's voice stayed level despite confession that should have been screamed or whispered but never stated as simple fact. Lord Matthias Thornwell seized my family's lands when I was 17, falsified claims of treason, executed my father and 2 brothers while forcing me into service as demonstration of mercy. I've served House Thornwell ever since, watching, planning, waiting for opportunity to inflict equivalent loss on the bloodline that took everything from me. You helped murder my wife to avenge grievances from 40 years ago. I facilitated conditions that allowed House Valamont and House Carlisle to murder your wife. There's a distinction that probably doesn't matter to you but matters to me. I never directly ordered her death, just provided information that made it possible. Kaedric moved forward slowly, hand dropping to the knife at his belt, fingers wrapping around grip worn smooth from years of use. You watched me grieve for 2 years, offered counsel, pretended sympathy, while knowing you'd helped kill her. Yes, and I'd do it again. Brennan finally showed emotion, jaw tightening. Your father was a monster who built this fortress on stolen lands and murdered families. You inherited that legacy and continued expanding it, crushing anyone who resisted Thornwell authority. The Duchess was unfortunate collateral in a war your family started generations ago. She had nothing to do with crimes committed by my ancestors. None of us have anything to do with crimes we're punished for. My father wasn't actually a traitor. My brothers weren't conspirators. But Lord Matthias needed land and our family occupied it, so he manufactured justification and took what he wanted. That's how power operates. Through violence dressed in legal ceremony. Brennan leaned forward slightly. What? So spare me the outrage about your wife's innocence. Innocence doesn't protect anyone when powerful men decide sacrifice serves their interests. The words hung in the air like smoke from fires that had burned too long to extinguish cleanly. Kaedric's hand tightened on the knife, rage and grief and something almost resembling understanding warring inside his chest. Everything Brennan described matched the historical records Seraphina had been reading in the restricted library, the patterns of expansion and elimination that had kept Ravenmarch powerful by making examples brutal enough that resistance became suicidal. His family's legacy wasn't honorable leadership. It was calculated violence that worked until someone decided returning that violence was worth 40 years of patience. You spent 4 decades pretending loyalty while planning revenge. I spent 4 decades surviving while waiting for the family that destroyed mine to experience equivalent loss. Brennan's eyes were hard as the stones surrounding them. Your father took everything from me, so I took something from you. We're even now. Even. Kaedric's voice dropped to something dangerous. You think facilitating my wife's murder makes us even. I think it makes you understand what your family inflicted on mine. That's worth more than gold or titles or whatever consequences you're about to deliver. The knife cleared its sheath in motion smooth as water flowing downhill. Kedrick crossed the distance between them in 2 steps, blade pressing against Brennan's throat, hard enough to draw a thin line of blood, but not deep enough to sever anything immediately fatal. The old advisor didn't flinch, didn't beg, just met Kedrick's eyes with expression of someone who'd already decided death was acceptable cost for seeing justice delivered to the bloodline that had consumed his family. Do it. At least I die knowing House Thornwell finally paid for crimes everyone else pretends never happened. Kedrick's hand trembled, not from fear or uncertainty, but from rage so pure it felt like fire consuming from inside. Every instinct screamed to drive the blade forward, to end the man who'd betrayed him, to extract physical payment for grief and manipulation, and 2 years of being played by someone he'd trusted absolutely. But Seraphina's words from the previous night echoed somewhere beneath the fury. That strength sometimes meant restraint even when violence demanded demonstration. That capability didn't require constant proof. That paranoia and isolation destroyed from within as effectively as any external conspiracy. And killing Brennan wouldn't resurrect Elise, wouldn't undo the past, would just add another body to foundations already built on too many corpses justified through necessity and legacy. He withdrew the knife slowly, stepped back, breathing hard enough that ribs ached. You don't get execution. That's too clean, too merciful. You get to live knowing your revenge accomplished nothing except proving you're exactly what my father claimed. A traitor willing to sacrifice innocent people to settle grievances that should have died with the generation that committed them. Brennan's expression shifted into something almost like confusion. You're letting me live. I'm letting you witness consequences. House Valamont and House Carlisle will be destroyed. Every noble involved in my wife's murder will face trials they can't bribe or manipulate their way through. And you'll live long enough to watch the conspiracy you helped build collapse into nothing while locked in chambers where the only company is guilt and memory. That's not justice. No. That's survival. Justice is luxury afforded to people who believe systems work. I don't believe in systems anymore. I believe in consequences delivered to people who earned them, regardless of whether law or custom approves. He moved toward the door, pausing at the threshold. Guards will take you to the old tower. Stone walls, no windows, food and water enough to keep you alive, and time to contemplate whether 40 years of patience was worth destroying the last person in this fortress who might have actually trusted you. The door closed on Brennan's face, expression finally cracking into something that looked like the realization that sometimes living was worse punishment than dying. Yibad. The council chamber filled slowly as dawn gave way to full morning. Noble families who'd survived the night's revelations gathered with expressions ranging from fear to calculation. Every person present understanding they were witnessing either the consolidation of Ravenmarch's power or its complete collapse into chaos that would consume the northern territories. Kedrick entered last, Seraphina beside him in position that communicated alliance, whether actual or performed. She'd asked no questions when he summoned her. Just appeared dressed in black that made her look like widow mourning future everyone could see approaching but no one could prevent. He took his position at the head of the table, standing rather than sitting, forcing everyone else to either stand in respect or remain seated in submission. Most chose standing. Those who remained seated revealed exactly where their loyalties had settled. Aldrich Thorne's confession is documented and signed. Lord Brennan Vale's financial records confirm his involvement in facilitating intelligence that enabled the Duchess's assassination, and investigations are ongoing regarding 17 noble families implicated in the conspiracy. Silence consumed the chamber except for breathing that came too quickly from people calculating survival odds. Here's what happens next. Kedrick's voice carried the weight of someone who'd stopped negotiating and started dictating. Every family named in Aldrich's confession will submit to Crown investigation without diplomatic interference. Assets will be frozen. Trade privileges suspended. Military authority transferred to provisional oversight until trials conclude. Lord Nathaniel Valamont stood abruptly. You can't unilaterally suspend noble privileges without Crown authorization. I can, and I am. Because the alternative is I release complete documentation of the conspiracy publicly and let the kingdom tear itself apart through trials. That would drag on for years while accomplishing nothing except destabilizing territories already fragile from mismanagement and corruption. This is tyranny. Lady Cordelia Carlyle's voice shook with barely controlled fury. You're using your wife's death as justification for consolidating power that the Crown explicitly limited. My wife's death isn't justification. It's evidence of what happens when noble families think murder is acceptable political strategy. Kedrick leaned forward, hands pressing against wood. You conspired to kill a duchess. You bribed crown officials. You manufactured evidence to frame a duke for crimes you committed. And now you want to lecture me about tyranny because I'm delivering consequences you thought diplomatic immunity would prevent. The crown will never support this overreach. The crown will support whatever creates more stability than the alternative. And right now, allowing 17 noble families to stand trial in public courts while their supporters riot in the streets creates significantly less stability than me handling this situation internally through methods that don't require years of legal theater. He straightened, scanning faces that reflected growing understanding that power had shifted completely and arguing would only determine how painful the transition became. You have 3 choices. Submit to investigation voluntarily and cooperate fully with documentation of the conspiracy. Fight the investigation and face charges of obstruction that will be added to treason and murder. Or flee the kingdom entirely and accept exile as permanent status, with all holdings seized to crown authority. That's not 3 choices. Nathaniel's face had gone pale. That's extortion. That's reality. Your family's conspired to murder my wife. The evidence is documented. The crown can either prosecute openly through years of expensive trials that accomplish nothing except creating political instability, or they can allow me to handle this situation through methods that restore order quickly while ensuring guilty parties face consequences. Either way, you're finished. The only variable is whether you go down fighting or cooperatively. Cordelia stood slowly, composure cracking into something close to desperation. If we cooperate, what assurances do we have that you won't simply execute us after extracting confessions? You have my word that cooperation earns trials before crown magistrates instead of being found dead in convenient accidents that raise no questions. Kedrick's tone suggested he understood exactly how insufficient that assurance was and didn't care. It's more mercy than you showed my wife. The chamber dissolved into chaos as nobles shouted over each other, some demanding crown intervention, others calculating whether cooperation or resistance offered better survival odds. Kedrick let the noise build for 30 seconds before slamming his hand against the table hard enough to make everyone freeze. Enough. You have 24 hours to decide. After that, any family that hasn't submitted to investigation will be treated as hostile and dealt with accordingly. He moved toward the exit, Seraphina following half a step behind. Meeting dismissed. They walked in silence through corridors that felt different now, less like fortress and more like monument to accumulated violence that would eventually consume everything it claimed to protect. Servants pressed against walls as they passed. Guards shifted weight nervously, everyone understanding that something fundamental had changed and the old rules no longer applied. Seraphina spoke quietly once they reached the private wing. You gave them 24 hours because you're hoping some of them run. Running identifies guilt faster than interrogation, and it gives me legal justification to seize holdings without lengthy court battles. So you're forcing them to choose between imprisonment and exile. Either way, you win. Either way, Ravenmarch survives. That's the only outcome that matters now. She studied him with expression he couldn't quite read. You sound like someone who's decided survival requires becoming exactly what your enemies claimed you were. I sound like someone who's learned that the difference between monster and hero is just which side of the violence you're standing on. He stopped at the door to his study. My father built this fortress through calculated brutality. I inherited it thinking leadership could be less ruthless. And that belief got my wife killed by people who mistook restraint for weakness. So yes, I'm becoming what they claimed I was. Because the alternative is letting the conspiracy succeed and House Thornwell collapsing into nothing while the families who murdered Elise divide our lands among themselves. And me. Seraphina's voice stayed quiet. Where do I fit in this transformation? You're the reminder that not everything is corruption and conspiracy. That someone exists inside these walls who hasn't spent decades calculating how to profit from proximity to power. That's a lot of weight to place on someone you barely know. Weight is all I have left to distribute. He entered the study alone, closing the door on her expression that suggested she understood exactly what he'd just admitted, and wasn't certain whether that understanding made her more valuable or more vulnerable. The attack came at sunset 3 days later, not from noble families facing investigation, but from mercenaries hired weeks earlier when conspiracy architects, realized Kaedric might survive attempts to frame him legally and require elimination through more direct methods. They infiltrated through the eastern drainage system, avoiding main gates and guard stations, emerging inside the castle with military precision that suggested someone had provided detailed maps of Ravenmarch's internal structure. 20 men armed with crossbows and blades designed for close-quarters combat, where noise might alert defenders before objectives were achieved. Their target wasn't the Duke. It was Seraphina. She'd been in the library when they breached, reading by candlelight that made shadows move wrong across vaulted ceiling. The first indication something was wrong came from silence, where there should have been servant activity in corridors beyond. The second came from crossbow bolt that shattered the window behind her head, glass exploding across stone floor like frozen rain. She dropped immediately, table flipping for cover that wouldn't stop bolts but might slow them enough to matter. Training her father had insisted upon despite their house's poverty flooded back. How to move during ambush. Where to position body to minimize target area. Which directions offered escape versus fatal bottlenecks. Another bolt slammed into wood inches from her shoulder. Then boots thundered in the corridor and mercenaries poured through the door with efficiency that spoke of professionals who'd done this work before and survived when targets hadn't. She rolled left, grabbing the knife she'd started carrying after Aldrich's interrogation, knowing it was useless against 20 armed men, but having it meant dying with weapon in hand instead of helpless. The first mercenary died before reaching her. Arrow through the throat, delivered from doorway where castle guards had finally responded to sounds of invasion. The second mercenary turned toward new threat, giving Seraphina opening to drive her knife upward into his thigh, severing artery that painted stone floor red. Then chaos consumed everything. Guards flooded the library while mercenaries fought with desperation of men who understood capture meant interrogation worse than death. Crossbow bolts and arrows filled air that smelled like blood and smoke from candles kicked over during struggle. Someone screamed. Someone else gurgled wetly and went silent. Seraphina crawled behind shelving, breathing hard, hands shaking from adrenaline and proximity to death that had missed her skull by 4 inches. Around her, the battle raged with brutal efficiency. Castle guards had training and numbers. Mercenaries had surprise and willingness to die rather than face torture chambers below. It lasted maybe 3 minutes. Felt like hours. When silence finally settled, 12 mercenaries lay dead or dying across library floor that would require complete replacement after blood soaked too deep into stone. 8 guards were wounded. 2 would die from injuries before morning. Captain Holt appeared in the doorway, armor dented from impacts, sword dark with blood that dripped slowly onto already saturated floor. His eyes scanned the carnage, found Seraphina crouched behind shelving, and something like relief crossed features trained not to show emotion during combat. "Lady Seraphina, you're injured." She looked down, discovered blood on her hands and dress, couldn't determine how much was hers versus the mercenary whose artery she'd opened. Just scratches. Nothing serious. "We need to move you to a secure location. More might be inside the castle." "Where's the Duke?" "Locked in the war room coordinating defense." Holt moved closer, offering hand to help her stand. He gave orders to prioritize your safety the moment attack began. "You're more valuable alive than whatever intelligence dead mercenaries might provide." She took his hand, standing on legs that trembled but held. "Why would they target me instead of Kaedric?" "Because killing the Duke makes him a martyr and consolidates Ravenmarch against external threats. But killing you demoralizes him personally while eliminating the political insurance your survival represents." Holt guided her toward the exit, stepping over bodies that stared at ceiling with eyes that would never close naturally again. "You're the leverage that proves he's capable of protecting what matters. Removing that leverage makes him look weak at exactly the moment his enemies need him to appear weak." They moved through corridors lined with guards stationed every 20 feet, crossbows aimed at shadows. Everyone understanding this wasn't random violence, but coordinated assault designed to crack foundation already destabilized by revelations about conspiracy and betrayal. The war room occupied the central tower, accessible only through checkpoints that required password verification and physical recognition by officers who'd served long enough to know imposters from legitimate personnel. Kaedric stood at the central table covered with maps and reports, surrounded by military commanders updating defensive positions as information about the attack circulated through communication networks. He looked up as Seraphina entered, blood-covered and shaking, but alive. Something in his expression shifted from tactical calculation to fury so pure it made the air feel dangerous. How many breached? 20 confirmed dead. We're searching for others, but preliminary assessment suggests they infiltrated a single unit through eastern drainage. Holt moved to the table, pointing at map sections highlighted in red. Guards are sweeping every corridor, exits sealed. Anyone trying to leave now gets detained and questioned. Who hired them? Unknown. But they carried Valamont family sigils hidden in clothing. Could be legitimate connection or false flag designed to implicate them after negotiations began. Kaedric's hands pressed flat against the table, knuckles white. They targeted Seraphina specifically. Yes, sir. Crossbow trajectories and entry patterns confirmed she was primary objective. You were secondary target only if opportunity presented. The room went silent except for breathing that came faster than tactical discussions warranted. Everyone present understood what that targeting pattern meant. That enemies had shifted strategy from legal elimination to personal destruction. That Kaedric's emotional vulnerabilities had been identified and weaponized just as they'd been weaponized through Elise's murder. That history was repeating with surgical precision. Kaedric looked directly at Seraphina, jaw tight enough to make temples pulse. This ends now, not through investigations or trials or diplomatic solutions. Through demonstrating what happens when people mistake mercy for weakness repeatedly until the lesson requires permanent demonstration. Your Grace, Holt began, assemble strike teams. Every family implicated in the conspiracy gets simultaneous raids tonight. Seize all adults, separate them. Begin interrogations immediately using whatever methods extract information fastest. He straightened, voice dropping to something cold and final. And send word to the Crown that Ravenmarch is implementing emergency protocols due to assassination attempt against ducal household. Any interference will be treated as hostile action supporting the conspirators. Sir, that's essentially declaring independence from Crown authority. That's securing my territory against enemies who've demonstrated legal systems won't constrain them. If the Crown objects, they can send armies. We'll discuss their concerns after I've eliminated every threat inside my own borders. Commanders exchanged glances that communicated everything words couldn't, that this was the moment, the choice that would define whether Ravenmarch survived as stronghold or collapsed into chaos, that neighboring kingdoms would exploit until nothing remained except memory of power that had consumed itself. One by one they nodded, accepting orders that crossed every line protocol defined, understanding that survival sometimes required becoming exactly what enemies claimed, while ensuring those enemies didn't survive to celebrate being proven right. Holt saluted formally. Strike teams deploy at midnight. Estimated completion of operations within 48 hours. Make it 24. I want this finished before Crown officials arrive to question my authority. Kaedric turned back to Seraphina. You'll remain in secured quarters under guard until threats are eliminated. No arguments. I wasn't planning to argue. She met his eyes with expression that carried weight of someone who just survived targeted assassination. Just make certain when this ends, there's something left worth protecting. Otherwise, you're just proving Brennan was right about your family's legacy being built on violence that eventually consumes everything it touches. Then I'll prove him wrong by ensuring the violence consumes everyone except the people I decide are worth saving. The certainty in his voice suggested he genuinely believed that distinction was achievable, that surgical elimination of threats wouldn't metastasize into paranoia, an isolation that destroyed from within, that becoming the monster his enemies described was reversible once enemies were eliminated and safety restored. Seraphina wanted to believe it too, but she'd read enough history to know that men who crossed certain lines rarely found their way back to the people they'd been before crossing became necessary. And the man standing before her, surrounded by maps marking targets for elimination and commanders awaiting orders to deploy lethal force against noble families, had crossed so far beyond those lines that return might no longer be geographically possible. Tick. Midnight arrived wrapped in clouds that blocked starlight and turned the castle into Shadow Fortress, rising from darkness like monument to every nightmare civilization tried to prevent through law and custom, and the illusion that violence could be contained through ceremony. Strike teams deployed in waves, 20 men per target, hitting simultaneously to prevent warning from reaching other families. Orders were explicit. Secure all adults, minimal casualties unless resistance forced escalation. Priority was capture for interrogation, not elimination for convenience. But war rarely followed clean orders. By dawn, 4 noble houses had been raided successfully. Families secured. Initial interrogations begun in chambers designed specifically for extracting truth from people who'd spent lifetimes perfecting lies. Blood-stained stones that had witnessed similar interrogations for generations, each duke adding their own techniques while pretending the work was necessary evil rather than family tradition. The fifth raid encountered prepared resistance. House Marlowe had apparently received warning despite communication lockdowns. 30 guards fortified the manor house with crossbows and barricades that turned straightforward capture operation into siege. The strike team commander requested guidance, whether to withdraw and regroup or escalate to lethal force necessary to complete the mission. Kedrick's response was immediate. Escalate. No survivors among defenders. Secure the family for interrogation, but anyone offering armed resistance dies where they stand. What followed wasn't battle. It was execution delivered with military efficiency that cared nothing for honor or mercy or the possibility that defending your home against midnight raiders might be legitimate response rather than confession of guilt. By sunrise, House Marlowe's manor burned, while survivors knelt in courtyards surrounded by bodies of guards who died defending employers they'd probably served for decades. The family patriarch was dead, 2 sons wounded. Lady Marlowe and her daughter secured for transport back to Ravenmarch, where chambers waited and physicians stood ready to keep prisoners alive long enough to provide whatever information Payne could extract. Reports reached the war room as Kedrick reviewed tactical maps tracking remaining operations. Each update painted a picture of systematic dismantling of conspiracy infrastructure. Houses raided, families secured, evidence seized that would take months to fully analyze, but appeared to confirm connection to assassination attempt, and broader efforts to destabilize Ravenmarch's authority. Success measured in captured enemies and eliminated resistance. Victory that tasted like ash and blood, and the creeping realization that he'd just deployed lethal force against noble families based on confessions extracted under torture and pattern evidence that might be coordination or might be coincidence amplified through paranoia. But commitment to the course meant accepting that doubt was luxury he'd surrendered the moment he ordered strikes. That uncertainty about guilt couldn't stop operations already in motion. That being wrong about some targets was acceptable cost as long as actual conspirators were eliminated before they tried again. Seraphina appeared in the doorway, still under guard, but apparently tired of remaining confined while the fortress she'd been bound to executed operations that would define its future. She looked at the maps covered with markers indicating completed raids and ongoing operations. A Kedrick's face that had settled into expression beyond exhaustion or rage, into something that might have been resignation. How many dead? Her voice carried no judgment, just need for information that would contextualize whatever happened next. 47 defenders, 16 during the Marlowe assault. The rest distributed across other raids when resistance escalated beyond capture protocols. Kedrick didn't look up from maps. 0 casualties among families being detained for interrogation, which was the objective. And how many of those families are actually guilty versus how many just appeared guilty based on evidence extracted from people being tortured in your chambers? Now he looked up, eyes hard, as the decisions he'd been making for 72 hours without sleep or doubt. That's the question that separates leaders from philosophers. Leaders act on best available information even when certainty is impossible. Philosophers debate until enemies exploit hesitation and everyone dies while discussing the ethics of self-defense. That's not an answer. It's the only answer that matters when people tried to assassinate you in my fortress using intelligence someone provided about internal security. Every family we've detained tonight had connection to the conspiracy. Whether that connection rises to criminal guilt or just suspicious association doesn't change the fact they posed credible threat. She moved closer to the table, studying markers that represented lives disrupted and families destroyed based on calculations happening inside the mind of a man who'd been pushed past the point where mercy felt like option rather than suicide, dressed in prettier language. You're transforming Ravenmarch into surveillance state where suspicion equals guilt and proximity to conspiracy justifies preemptive elimination. That's not justice. That's the system your father built that Brennan spent 40 years resenting enough to facilitate your wife's murder. Then what would you have me do? Wait for the next assassination attempt and hope it fails as narrowly as this one did. Trust that legal systems corrupted by the same people trying to kill us will suddenly start functioning impartially. Sit in this fortress pretending restraint demonstrates strength, while enemies interpret it as weakness worth exploiting. He moved around the table, closing distance until they stood close enough that speaking required lowering voices to avoid commanders overhearing conversation that shouldn't happen in war rooms during active operations. I spent 2 years trying to do this correctly, following protocols, gathering evidence, working within systems designed to constrain power. And it accomplished nothing except confirming that those systems exist primarily to protect people wealthy enough to purchase verdicts while ordinary people suffer consequences. So yes, I'm becoming exactly what my enemies described, the ruthless duke who eliminates threats without waiting for permission from authorities compromised by bribes. And when this is finished, Ravenmarch will either survive as fortress that makes examples brutal enough that conspiracies become suicidal, or it'll collapse and prove that restraint was always just elaborate suicide performed slowly enough to feel noble. Seraphina held his gaze without flinching, despite exhaustion and fear and growing certainty that the man she'd been bound to had crossed beyond point where return was possible. And if surviving requires you to become the tyrant that makes even your father's legacy look restrained by comparison, what exactly are you preserving? Because the fortress might stand, but the person who built it will be gone, replaced by something that wears his face while operating from principles he would have rejected 2 years ago. 2 years ago, I was naive enough to believe love and loyalty and honor mattered more than power. My wife died proving that belief was fantasy. He turned back toward the maps. Now I understand that survival requires prioritizing power above everything else. And if that transformation makes me a tyrant, at least I'll be a living tyrant ruling a stable territory, rather than a dead idealist mourned by people who'll immediately carve up everything I tried to protect. The words hung between them like verdict already delivered with no possibility of appeal or reversal. Outside the war room, Ravenmarch continued operations that would reshape the northern territories through demonstration that challenging ducal authority carried costs too steep for rational calculation. Inside, a man and woman who'd been thrown together by circumstance and contract stood on opposite sides of chasm that had opened between person. Kadric had been, and person he was becoming, to ensure survival of fortress built on foundations he was only now fully understanding. Dawn broke across the Highlands, turning frozen landscape gold and crimson like the sky itself was reflecting blood spilled in darkness. While philosophy and survival fought battles that rarely produced winners anyone wanted to celebrate, and in chambers below, prisoners who might be guilty or might just be unlucky waited for interrogations that would determine whether their families had final generation or whether House Thornwell's legacy of calculated violence would consume them completely before the week ended. The interrogations yielded results faster than Kaedric had anticipated, and more horrifying than even his darkest suspicions had prepared him for. By the third day of coordinated operations, patterns emerged from confessions, extracted in chambers where screaming became background noise servants, learned to ignore while polishing silver and preparing meals that no one would eat with any appetite. The conspiracy wasn't limited to 17 noble families. It encompassed 43 houses spanning 3 territories and reached into the Crown's own administrative offices at levels that made Aldrich Thorne look like minor participant rather than architect. Every confession peeled back another layer, revealing coordination that had been building for 7 years, long before Elise's death, stretching back to when Kaedric's father still ruled and enemies had been calculating exactly how many pieces Ravenmarch could be divided into once the Thornwell bloodline was eliminated completely. Elise had been strategy. Remove the Duchess, isolate the Duke psychologically, wait for grief to compromise judgment, then move with legal accusations backed by forged evidence and bribes distributed so thoroughly that truth became irrelevant compared to coordinated narrative. It had almost worked. Would have worked if Kaedric had remained the man who believed restraint demonstrated strength, and protocol mattered more than survival. But that man had died somewhere between discovering his wife's murder and watching Seraphina nearly get killed by crossbow bolts aimed at eliminating the last thing preventing him from becoming pure. Weapon without constraint. Captain Holt entered the war room carrying reports that had become routine over 72 hours of systematic dismantling of conspiracy infrastructure. His face showed exhaustion that went beyond lack of sleep into territory where morality started questioning, whether orders should be followed versus whether following them transformed soldiers into something unrecognizable. Additional confessions confirmed Crown involvement at ministerial level. Lord Chancellor Greaves received payments totaling 80,000 gold marks to ensure investigations into the Duchess's death remained inconclusive. 3 royal magistrates were bribed to prepare verdicts regardless of evidence presented during your tribunal. And there's coordination with southern kingdoms interested in destabilizing the northern territories for territorial expansion once Ravenmarch collapsed. Caedric studied maps now covered with markers indicating depth of conspiracy that extended beyond noble houses into the fundamental structure holding the kingdom together. This wasn't political maneuvering. This was coordinated attempt to fracture the realm by eliminating its strongest northern defense, while internal enemies carved up territories before external threats could mobilize. How many prisoners are providing testimony versus how many are telling interrogators what they think we want to hear to stop the pain? Holt's jaw tightened. Difficult to determine with certainty. Cross-referencing suggests core narrative is accurate, even if specific details vary between sources. But yes, some confessions likely include fabrication designed to end questioning. Then we verify through action instead of additional interrogation. Caedric straightened from the table, decision crystallizing into clarity that came from accepting there was no clean path forward. Send word to Lord Chancellor Greaves that I'm requesting immediate audience in the capital to discuss Crown concerns about Ravenmarch's recent operations. Make it seem like I'm capitulating. Seeking reconciliation. Sir, Greaves is implicated in the conspiracy. Walking into the capital is suicide. Walking into the capital as a duke requesting permission is suicide. Walking in with 40 armed men and documented proof of ministerial corruption while the crown is still calculating. Whether supporting me or destroying me serves their interests better is negotiation from position of strength. He moved toward the window overlooking courtyard where soldiers drilled with intensity that came from understanding real combat was approaching fast. Either the crown accepts that prosecuting me means exposing corruption at levels that would destabilize the monarchy itself, or they move against me openly and we fight a civil war that neither side can afford. That's not negotiation. That's forcing the crown to choose between 2 catastrophic options. That's giving them the option to choose the less catastrophic one. Which is exactly what negotiation looks like when clean solutions stopped existing 3 years ago. Seraphina's voice came from the doorway, where she'd apparently been standing long enough to hear strategy that would either secure Ravenmarch's future or guarantee its complete destruction within the week. What happens if the crown decide prosecuting you is worth the instability because leaving you in power sets precedent they can't tolerate? Caedric turned, finding her dressed in traveling clothes that suggested she'd already decided she was coming regardless of whether he ordered otherwise. Then Ravenmarch secures independence through military force, and we spend the next decade defending borders, while the kingdom tears itself apart, fighting over who's responsible for letting a duke defy crown authority successfully. So either way, thousands die. You just get to choose whether they die quickly through civil war or slowly through investigations and trials that accomplish nothing except prolonged suffering. Her assessment was accurate enough to sting. Some part of him wanted to argue, to insist there were better options if he just thought harder or planned more carefully or found some diplomatic solution everyone had somehow overlooked. But exhaustion and accumulated violence had burned away the capacity for self-deception that made leadership tolerable. Yes, thousands die either way. The only choice I have is whether those deaths serve purpose or just feed chaos that consumes everyone, including the people I'm trying to protect. And I'm one of those people you're trying to protect. She moved into the room fully, guards trailing behind her until she waved them back with gesture that communicated this conversation required privacy. Which means I have a say in whether your protection strategy is worth the cost it's demanding. You have the choice to stay here where defenses are strongest, while I handle negotiations that'll determine whether Ravenmarch survives as autonomous territory or gets absorbed into crown authority. I have the choice to come with you and demonstrate that the Duke everyone fears is capable of maintaining alliances and protecting what matters. She stopped across the table from him. You said I was political insurance. That my survival proved you could defend what you claim to value. So use that insurance. Bring me to the capital. Let the crown see that destroying you means explaining why the contracted bride you're accused of endangering is standing beside you voluntarily while you present evidence of their ministers conspiring to murder a duchess. It's too dangerous. If negotiations fail, I'd rather die in the capital fighting beside someone who actually tried to prevent it than in this fortress waiting to be overrun by forces that'll rape and murder me, as demonstration of what happens to dukes' households when dukes defy crown authority. Her voice stayed level despite describing scenarios that should have required screaming. You taught me that survival sometimes requires rejecting safety in favor of strategic risk. So let me take the risk that serves both our interests. Holt cleared his throat carefully. Lady Seraphina makes a valid tactical point. Her presence complicates the Crown's narrative while providing human element that might generate sympathy among officials still calculating which side benefits them most. Kaedric studied her face, searching for fear or manipulation or any indication this was performance rather than genuine decision. Found only determination that mirrored what he saw in his own reflection during the rare moments he could stand looking at what he'd become. The reality was she was right. Bringing her demonstrated confidence that negotiations would succeed, that he wasn't fleeing to the capital as desperate supplicant, but arriving as duke, demanding recognition of crown corruption. And if negotiations failed, at least she'd be close enough that he could prioritize her survival when violence erupted and priorities collapsed into pure instinct, which revealed exactly how compromised his judgment had become. That protecting one person mattered more than strategic concerns about appearing weak or sentimental, or any of the calculations that should have governed decision-making when entire territories hung in balance. But men who'd been pushed past breaking points by accumulated loss and betrayal didn't make decisions based on strategy anymore. They made them based on whatever fragile foundations remained after everything else had been stripped away through violence and revelation. And the only foundation he had left was the woman standing across the table, refusing to accept protection that would leave her helpless, when the fortress inevitably faced forces powerful enough to crack walls his ancestors had believed were impregnable. We leave at dawn. 40 men, full armor, every piece of documentation proving ministerial corruption. And you stay within arm's reach at all times once we're inside the capital. Non-negotiable. Understood. She nodded once, satisfaction flickering across features before settling back into composure. Should I prepare for the possibility we won't be returning to Ravenmarch? Prepare for the possibility that anyone who rides with us understands this mission either secures our future or ends it. There's no middle outcome anymore. After she left, Holt remained standing at attention with expression that suggested he had something to say, but wasn't certain saying it would improve anything. Kaedric waited, exhaustion making patience easier than usual because energy required for impatience had been spent maintaining control while ordering operations that transformed him into exactly what Brennan had claimed his family represented. Sir, the men are ready to follow your orders, but they need to understand what success looks like. Are we negotiating for continued autonomy within Crown authority, or are we preparing for full independence regardless of what the Crown offers? The question cut to the core of what Kaedric himself hadn't fully decided. Whether this was final attempt to remain part of kingdom that had failed him repeatedly, or whether accumulated betrayals had severed loyalty beyond repair, and Ravenmarch needed to stand alone even if standing. Alone meant decades of defensive warfare against kingdoms that would interpret independence as invitation to conquest. Success looks like Ravenmarch surviving with enough authority to prevent noble houses from conspiring to murder duchesses without consequences. Everything else is negotiable. He moved toward the door, stopping at the threshold. But if the Crown refuses even that minimum guarantee, then we stop negotiating and start fortifying. Because I'd rather fight external enemies honestly than internal ones who use law as weapon while ignoring its constraints themselves. Holt saluted with precision that came from career spent following orders, even when orders led places darker than anyone anticipated. Understood, sir. I'll inform the men we're preparing for both outcomes. The ride to the capital took 4 days through territories that watched them pass with expressions ranging from fear to speculation to barely concealed hostility. News had spread about raids on noble houses and interrogations happening in Ravenmarch's chambers. Some villages welcomed them as liberators who'd finally held corrupt nobility accountable. Others barred gates and watched from walls like they were witnessing invasion force that would eventually turn its violence toward anyone who failed to demonstrate sufficient loyalty. Kaedric rode at the front of the column with Seraphina beside him, 40 soldiers arrayed in formation that communicated both protection and threat. This wasn't diplomatic envoy arriving hat in hand to beg crown forgiveness. This was armed duke, arriving to present evidence and demand accountability from authorities who'd spent years enabling the conspiracy that killed his wife. Every mile closer to the capital felt like counting down toward detonation no one could prevent. The question wasn't whether explosion would happen, but how catastrophic the blast radius would become once all the accumulated pressure finally released. They spoke little during the journey. Words felt inadequate compared to understanding that had developed between two people who'd been thrown together by circumstance, and discovered they were both survivors of systems designed to consume anyone who stopped performing submission convincingly enough. But on the third night, camped in territory that belonged to Minor House, still calculating which side of the coming conflict offered better odds, Seraphina broke the silence that had settled over them like snow covering graves. "You know this won't end the way you're hoping." Her voice came quiet enough that soldiers stationed around the perimeter wouldn't overhear conversation happening in command tent where maps and documents covered surfaces like evidence of crimes that hadn't been committed yet. Kaedric looked up from correspondence he'd been reviewing for the 100th time, searching for weaknesses and arguments he'd prepared for Crown officials who'd already decided his guilt before examining evidence. "I'm not hoping for anything except opportunity to present truth before violence becomes only language anyone understands. The Crown won't accept your truth because accepting it means admitting their own ministers conspired to murder a duchess. That's institutional failure at level that delegitimizes the monarchy's claim to authority." She moved closer to the table, firelight making her features look carved from shadow. "They'll sacrifice you to preserve that legitimacy, even if the sacrifice means ignoring evidence that would exonerate you completely. Then, I'll make the cost of sacrifice too expensive to justify. Show them that destroying Ravenmarch produces more instability than tolerating a duke who defied protocols while exposing corruption. And if that doesn't work, if they decide making an example of you serves their interests better than justice or stability or any principle you think should matter, then we fight our way out of the capital and return to Ravenmarch to prepare for siege that'll last years and consume thousands of lives." He set down the documents. "But at least those deaths will serve purpose beyond enabling corruption to continue unchallenged." She studied him with expression he'd learned meant she was calculating whether honesty would help or just accelerate deterioration of situation already balanced on edge, sharp enough to cut stone. "You sound like someone who's accepted that survival requires becoming monster, while hoping somehow the transformation remains reversible once threats are eliminated. I sound like someone who's discovered that the difference between monster and protector is just perspective held by people too comfortable to understand what survival actually costs." The fire crackled in silence that followed. Outside the tent, soldiers maintained watch over camp positioned defensively because trust had become luxury. No one in the column could afford any more. Everyone understood tomorrow would bring them within sight of capital walls where Crown authority concentrated and decisions about. Ravenmarch's future would be made by officials who'd already been paid to ensure certain outcomes regardless of evidence presented. Seraphina moved around the table until she stood close enough that speaking required lowering voice to intimate level that felt dangerous for different reasons than political or military threats. "I need you to understand something before we ride into whatever happens tomorrow." He waited, instinct suggesting this was a moment where truth got spoken that couldn't be taken back once articulated. "I came to Ravenmarch expecting to hate you. Expecting to survive through strategic submission until opportunity for escape presented itself." She paused, choosing words carefully. "But watching you fight against conspiracy designed to break you while refusing to become purely the weapon everyone claims you are, that changed calculation. You're not the monster your enemies describe, but you're becoming one by trying to prove them wrong through methods that confirm everything they've accused you of. Then what should I do? Let them destroy me while maintaining moral superiority. That'll be forgotten the moment my corpse is buried and territories get divided among the same families who murdered Elise. No. You should accept that some battles can't be won through violence or evidence or forcing enemies to acknowledge truth they've already decided to ignore." She reached across the table, hand resting on documents that represented everything he'd built the case around. "You should consider that maybe Ravenmarch's survival doesn't require the Crown's approval. That independence is option, even if it means decades of defensive warfare and isolation from kingdoms that would rather see you destroyed than tolerate Duke who defied them successfully. That's treason. That's survival. And you taught me that survival matters more than labels applied by people who won't face consequences of their own corruption." The words hung between them like verdict waiting to be accepted or rejected. Everything Kaedric had been raised to believe said that loyalty to crown and kingdom mattered. That defying royal authority was ultimate betrayal of oaths sworn and responsibilities inherited. That independence meant abandoning centuries of integration and shared history. But those beliefs had been taught by father, who'd built power through calculated violence while pretending ceremony made it legitimate, by systems that protected wealthy conspirators while punishing victims who fought back without permission, by authorities who'd enabled his wife's murder, then attempted to frame him for the crime while their own ministers collected payment for coordinating the assassination. At what point did loyalty to corrupted system become suicide dressed in prettier language? At what point did survival require accepting that the fortress you'd inherited needed to stand alone because kingdoms surrounding it had proven they'd sacrifice anything to maintain illusions of legitimacy and control? If we declare independence, the crown will send armies. Multiple kingdoms will see it as opportunity to seize northern territories. We'll face siege warfare that could last decades, while resources drain and allies abandon us rather than face crown retribution for supporting rebellion. Yes, all of that is true. She didn't look away, didn't soften assessment of costs that declaring independence would demand. But you'll face those threats as Duke defending his own territory, rather than noblemen begging crown officials corrupted by same enemies trying to destroy you. And your soldiers will fight harder defending independence than they would defending your right to remain subordinate to authority that betrayed you. Kjedrik stood slowly, moving to tent entrance, looking out at camp where 40 men prepared weapons and checked armor, because tomorrow would bring them face to face with power that had been consolidated through centuries of building systems that claimed legitimacy while operating through methods they condemned when anyone else employed them. Every man in that camp had volunteered for this mission, knowing it might be suicide. Knowing their duke was riding into capital to present evidence that would either force crown accountability or justify. Crown eliminating them all as convenient demonstration of what happened to subjects who defied royal authority. They'd come anyway, because loyalty wasn't about oaths or ceremony or abstract concepts of duty. Loyalty was about following someone willing to face consequences alongside the people depending on them, instead of sacrificing subordinates to preserve their own position. His father had never understood that distinction, had treated loyalty as commodity purchased through fear and payment rather than earned through shared risk and genuine care for people whose lives depended on decisions made in war rooms and throne chambers. Maybe that's why Brennan had betrayed him so easily. Not because 40 years of service meant nothing, but because 40 years of service without genuine connection produced resentment that eventually found expression through facilitating the murder of someone innocent. Maybe that's why Seraphina's presence mattered so much despite barely knowing her, because she'd chosen to stand beside him when walking away would have been safer and arguably more rational, because her survival had become personal priority rather than just strategic consideration, because somewhere in the accumulated violence and revelation and transformation that had consumed the past week, he'd stopped being just Duke protecting territory and started being man, trying to save the one thing he'd decided was worth saving, even if saving it required burning everything else to foundation. Tomorrow we present evidence to the crown. We give them opportunity to choose accountability over corruption. And if they refuse, we declare Ravenmarch independent and prepare for war that'll define the next generation. He turned back toward her. But either way, you survive. That's the only non-negotiable outcome. I don't need protection. I need partnership. Someone willing to acknowledge that survival requires two people facing threats together rather than one person trying to shield the other from reality that'll consume them both if faced alone. Then you'll have partnership. But partnership where I reserve right to prioritize your life over tactical considerations when situations collapse into chaos where strategy stops mattering. She smiled then, brief and genuine despite exhaustion and accumulated stress. I can accept those terms. The capital rose from plains like monument to ambition and authority that had accumulated through centuries of consolidating power, while pretending legitimacy came from consent rather than coordinated violence dressed in ceremony. Walls 50 feet high, towers that watched approaches for miles, gates designed to channel invaders into kill zones where defenders could slaughter attackers who'd somehow survived the approach through exposed terrain. Ravenmarch's column rode through streets where crowds gathered to watch Duke Thornwell arrive under circumstances that everyone understood were either negotiation or prelude to violence that would reshape the kingdom. Some faces showed curiosity, others hostility. Most showed calculation that came from understanding powerful people's conflicts, created opportunities for those quick enough to position themselves advantageously before outcomes solidified. The royal palace occupied the city's center, architecture designed specifically to make visitors feel small and insignificant compared to authority concentrated within walls that had witnessed every form of human ambition and cruelty humans had developed through millennia of discovering new ways to dominate and destroy each other. Lord Chancellor Greaves waited in the reception hall, surrounded by ministers and officials whose expressions ranged from barely concealed contempt to professional neutrality that revealed nothing about allegiances already sold to highest bidders. He wore formal robes that cost more than most families earned in lifetimes, every thread communicating wealth and position that came from being an essential part of machinery, keeping kingdom functioning regardless of how many bodies got fed into gears to maintain operations. Duke Thornwell, I'm pleased you accepted our invitation to discuss recent events in your territories. His smile suggested pleasure was performative courtesy rather than genuine emotion. Though I must say, arriving with 40 armed soldiers creates impression that perhaps this meeting is being approached with undue hostility. I approach it with appropriate caution given that your office received 80,000 gold marks in bribes to ensure investigations into my wife's murder remained inconclusive. Cadric didn't bother with formalities, moving directly to presenting folders containing documentation that had been compiled through interrogations and financial investigations. Every payment is documented, every minister involved is named, every coordination point between your office and the noble families conspiring to murder a duchess and frame her husband is recorded in detail sufficient for prosecution. The hall went completely silent except for rustling parchment as officials examined documents that detailed corruption reaching into highest levels of crown administration. Faces that had shown contempt shifted into calculation. Professional neutrality cracked into concern. Everyone understanding that whatever happened next would determine whether the kingdom maintained illusion of lawful authority or admitted that law was just weapon wielded by whoever accumulated enough power to enforce verdicts regardless of evidence or justice. Greaves recovered quickly, which suggested he'd anticipated this confrontation even if not the specific details being presented. These documents were obtained through torture of prisoners detained without royal authorization during operations you conducted in violation of crown protocols regarding investigation and prosecution of nobility. Even if allegations contained in them are accurate, they're inadmissible as evidence. I'm not presenting them as evidence for your courts. I'm presenting them as proof that your corruption made those courts irrelevant. Cadric moved closer to the Chancellor. My wife was murdered by conspirators you enabled. I was nearly framed for that murder through investigations you compromised. And when I defended myself through the only methods your corruption left available, you summoned me here to stand trial for crimes significantly less egregious than those you've committed yourself. That's quite an accusation to make without... I'm done making accusations. I'm delivering ultimatum. He pulled additional documents from his coat. Complete financial records of bribes paid to 17 crown officials, including yourself. Testimony from 43 noble families detailing coordination with ministerial offices to destabilize northern territories. Evidence of conspiracy involving southern kingdoms interested in seizing lands once Ravenmarch collapsed. The crown has two options: acknowledge this corruption publicly, hold officials accountable, and restore sufficient legitimacy that subjects might continue believing in royal authority, or attempt to prosecute me for defending my territory while ignoring crimes committed by your own ministers, and watch Ravenmarch declare independence and fight civil war that'll consume the kingdom for decades. You're threatening the crown. Multiple officials stood, hands moving toward weapons they weren't supposed to carry during diplomatic meetings, but apparently had anyway because trust had stopped existing somewhere between accumulating evidence of conspiracy and realizing that evidence implicated everyone involved in maintaining systems that claimed to prevent exactly these kinds of coordinated betrayals. I'm offering choice between catastrophic outcomes. Choose the one that preserves some possibility of reconstruction. He looked directly at Greaves. Or choose the one that proves everything rebels and separatists have been saying about crown corruption being too fundamental to reform through anything except complete dismantling followed by rebuilding from principles that don't require bribes to function. Lord Chancellor Greaves stood slowly, composure cracking into fury that came from decades of wielding power, suddenly faced with subject who refused to acknowledge that power as legitimate. You ride into my city with armed force, present documents obtained through torture, threaten civil war unless I confess to crimes that would destabilize the monarchy itself, and expect me to choose the option that destroys my authority. I expect you to choose survival over pride. Because if you force this to violence, Ravenmarch will fight, and enough of the kingdom will support us that the crown will fracture trying to maintain control through military force over. Regions that no longer believe royal authority serves any purpose except protecting officials who accept bribes, while ordinary people suffer consequences. Seraphina stepped forward then, movement calculated to shift attention before Greaves could order guards to arrest everyone in Ravenmarch's contingent and end negotiation through imprisonment. Lord Chancellor, the Duke is presenting you with opportunity to be remembered as minister who acknowledged corruption and initiated reforms versus minister who enabled civil war because admitting mistakes was worse than destroying kingdom. History will judge which choice you make. Her voice carried weight that came from being contracted. Bride everyone knew had nearly been assassinated in an attempt to break the Duke psychologically. Living proof that threats were real and protection had value beyond abstract strategic concerns. Greaves stared at her for a long moment, calculation visible behind eyes that had witnessed decades of political maneuvering and survived through understanding. When to fight versus when to negotiate retreat that preserved essential positions while sacrificing peripheral ones. Finally he spoke, voice tight with controlled fury that came from recognizing leverage had shifted completely. The Crown will consider Duke Thornwell's evidence and concerns. A formal inquiry will be established to investigate allegations of ministerial corruption. In exchange, Ravenmarch will submit to temporary oversight, ensuring operations comply with royal protocols while investigations proceed. No! Cadric's response came immediate and final. Ravenmarch maintains autonomous authority over internal matters, including defense and justice. The Crown receives documentation proving conspiracy, but doesn't get oversight that would allow corrupt officials to interfere with holding conspirators accountable. That's the offer. Accept it, or we leave this hall and never return, except as independent territory defending borders against kingdom that chose corruption over reform. You're demanding the very independence you claim not to be pursuing. I'm demanding recognition that my territory's survival can't depend on trusting systems that have repeatedly betrayed me while punishing my attempts to defend against that betrayal. Call it independence. Call it autonomous authority. Call it whatever preserves the fiction that we're still part of the kingdom. But I won't subordinate Ravenmarch's security to oversight provided by officials who've already proven they'll sacrifice anything to maintain power. The hall dissolved into chaos as ministers shouted over each other, some demanding Cadric's immediate arrest for treason, others calculating whether supporting him offered better position in whatever power structure emerged from the current crisis. Guards moved toward flanking positions while Ravenmarch's soldiers closed ranks around their duke and the woman standing beside him. Greaves raised his hand, silence falling with speed that communicated authority accumulated through decades of making everyone understand that crossing Lord Chancellor meant consequences severe enough to serve as permanent lesson. Your terms are rejected. Crown authority is non-negotiable, and your presence in this city without submitting to legitimate oversight constitutes rebellion that will be met with full military response. He nodded toward guards. Detain Duke Thornwell and his retinue. They'll stand trial for treason against the Crown and conspiracy to undermine royal authority through armed intimidation. The moment crystallized into clarity that came from understanding that all the preparation and evidence and attempts at negotiation had been irrelevant from the beginning. Greaves had never intended to acknowledge corruption because acknowledging it meant admitting the Crown itself was complicit in murder and conspiracy. Better to eliminate the Duke exposing those crimes than allow truth to delegitimize monarchy that had maintained power through carefully constructed illusion of lawful authority. Cadric's hand dropped to sword grip, 40 soldiers behind him making identical motion, understanding signal without requiring explicit orders, because career soldiers recognized moment when talking stopped and survival required immediate violence. Seraphina moved closer, voice urgent. There are 200 guards in this building, and 1,000 more within the palace complex. We can't fight our way out. We don't have to fight our way out. He kept his eyes locked on Greaves while speaking. We just have to fight long enough to ensure the Chancellor's capture or death makes continuing the battle pointless for everyone who's calculating survival odds rather than following orders from loyalty. That's suicide. That's survival. Because if we surrender, we die in Crown custody during convenient accidents that raise no questions. And if we run, we prove we're cowards instead of Duke defending legitimate grievances against corrupt officials. So you'd rather die fighting impossible battle than live by accepting Crown authority you know is illegitimate. I'd rather force them to demonstrate their corruption is worth killing Duke and his household inside their own palace while witnesses watch and calculate whether Crown authority they're supposed to. Respect is worth defending at cost of enabling murder and conspiracy. Guards advanced from 3 directions, crossbows aimed, swords drawn, every face showing professional calculation that came from understanding they were about to kill nobleman and his retinue inside Royal Palace Inn. In front of dozens of witnesses who would carry stories of this confrontation into territories where trust in crown authority was already fragile. Kedrick drew his sword, motion smooth despite exhaustion and accumulated stress, blade catching light from windows designed to illuminate hall with majesty, instead of showing splashes of blood that would stain marble floors within seconds of violence erupting. Behind him, 40 men drew weapons in unified motion that communicated years of training and absolute willingness to follow Duke, who'd proven he faced consequences alongside people depending on him instead of sacrificing them to preserve his own position. Seraphina pulled knife from her belt, small blade that was useless against armored soldiers, but having it meant dying armed rather than helpless, which was the only dignity available once survival stopped being possible through negotiation or retreat. Greaves smiled without humor. "You're proving everything we've accused you of, Duke Thornwell. That Ravenmarch represents threat to stability that must be eliminated regardless of whatever evidence you believe justifies your rebellion. I'm proving that Crown authority lost legitimacy the moment it prioritized protecting corrupt ministers over delivering justice to Duke, whose wife was murdered by conspiracy your office enabled." Kedrick's voice carried across the hall, reaching officials still calculating which side to support, reaching guards wondering whether killing Duke served their interests or just served Chancellor, who'd been paid to ensure certain outcomes. "Every person in this room will remember this moment. Will remember that I came here seeking accountability, and you responded with arrest and execution for daring to expose crimes committed by Crown officials. And they'll also remember you died defying lawful authority while claiming victimhood. History is written by survivors, Duke Thornwell, and you won't be among them." The guards tensed, readying for rush that would overwhelm through numbers, even though first wave would suffer casualties that made the victory Pyrrhic at best. Kedrick shifted stance, preparing for violence that would define how Ravenmarch was remembered, regardless of whether Fortress survived the coming war. Seraphina's hand found his briefly, grip communicating everything words couldn't about partnership and choice, and deciding that standing together during impossible battle was better than surviving separately through submission that would feel like death anyway. Then doors at the hall's far end exploded open with force that made everyone freeze and turn toward. Sound that shouldn't have interrupted confrontation already balanced on edge, sharp enough to cut futures. Captain Marcus Holt strode through the entrance leading 200 soldiers wearing Ravenmarch colors and armor dented from combat that had apparently already started somewhere outside the palace. His face showed grim satisfaction as he surveyed the scene, taking in the standoff that was seconds from erupting into violence that would consume everyone present. "Apologies for the delay, Your Grace. We encountered resistance securing the outer courtyards, but the palace is now surrounded and all gates are under our control." He moved to stand beside Kedrick, soldiers filing in behind him with precision that communicated they'd fought through significant opposition to reach this position. "Lord Chancellor Greaves, I believe the Duke's terms deserve reconsideration now that circumstances have shifted." The hall erupted into chaos for the second time, officials screaming about military invasion and treason and responses that would rain down on Ravenmarch like divine judgment. But beneath the noise, reality settled into shape that everyone understood changed everything about calculations they'd been making regarding which side offered better survival odds. Ravenmarch had just occupied the royal palace with military force sufficient to hold it against immediate response while demonstrating that Duke Thornwell had planned for exactly this outcome. Regardless of whether negotiations succeeded, this wasn't rebellion anymore. This was revolution waiting to discover whether Crown would acknowledge defeat or fight war that would consume kingdom completely. And every person in that hall was now choosing between being remembered as someone who enabled reform, or someone who died defending corruption that had finally been exposed too thoroughly to ignore. Any longer, the standoff held for 3 seconds that stretched into eternity, while everyone in the hall calculated survival odds that had shifted so dramatically that previous certainties collapsed into chaos. Where protocol and authority meant nothing compared to immediate question of whether living through the next hour was even possible. Greaves broke first, which was inevitable once he understood that 200 armed soldiers occupied the palace and escape routes had been sealed by forces that had apparently anticipated Crown resistance regardless of how negotiations proceeded. His face went through expressions ranging from fury to calculation before settling into something approaching acceptance that, came from decades of political survival teaching him when fighting accomplished nothing except hastening inevitable defeat. You've committed treason against the crown and invaded royal property with military force. The words came automatic but hollow, lacking conviction that might have made them meaningful. No negotiation can proceed under these circumstances. Then we won't negotiate. Kedrick's voice carried across the hall with finality that communicated he'd passed the point where retreat was possible. You'll sign document acknowledging ministerial corruption and authorizing crown inquiry into officials implicated in conspiracy to murder Duchess Elise. You'll recognize Ravenmarch's autonomous authority over internal matters, including justice and defense. And you'll do it within the hour, or Captain Holt begins executing ministers in descending order of seniority until someone, with sufficient authority, decides that signing is preferable to watching colleagues die for crimes they've already committed. The hall erupted into shouting that got cut short when Holt's soldiers moved into positions that communicated this wasn't threat, but statement of immediate intention backed by force already deployed, and waiting for signal to commence operations that would paint marble floors red, regardless of how many witnesses recorded the events for historical judgment. Seraphina stepped forward slightly, voice cutting through chaos with clarity that came from understanding sometimes the only way to prevent catastrophic violence was demonstrating you understood exactly what catastrophic violence would cost, and had decided the cost was acceptable. Lord Chancellor, the Duke is offering you the opportunity to be remembered as minister who reformed corruption versus minister who died defending it. Every person in this hall knows those are the only two outcomes possible now. Choose quickly, because soldiers who fought their way through palace guards to reach this position aren't inclined toward patient deliberation. Several ministers moved toward Greaves, whispering urgently, faces showing fear that came from realizing they'd been complicit in conspiracy that was now being exposed through methods that didn't care about legal procedure or diplomatic immunity. Some were probably calculating whether cooperation earned mercy. Others were likely planning how to shift blame toward colleagues and minimize their own involvement. All of them understood that the systems they'd relied upon to insulate them from consequences had collapsed the moment Duke Thornwell decided survival required force rather than faith in authorities, who'd proven they couldn't be trusted to deliver anything except coordinated betrayal. Greaves looked at the soldiers surrounding him, at the Duke standing with sword still drawn, an expression that suggested he'd genuinely accepted that dying. Here was acceptable cost as long as it forced crown acknowledgement of the corruption that had killed his wife. At Seraphina beside him, representing an alliance built on shared understanding that sometimes refusing to surrender mattered more than surviving through submission. The Chancellor's shoulders sagged slightly, which was the first genuine emotion he'd shown since confrontation began. Bring me the documents. I'll review terms before signing anything that grants a rebellious Duke authority to. You'll sign without review because you don't have leverage to negotiate terms. Holt moved forward, placing parchment on table before the Chancellor. Every moment you delay, my men get more restless, and restless soldiers in occupied palace tend to interpret hesitation as resistance worth eliminating. This is extortion backed by military occupation. This is consequences delivered to officials who spent years thinking corruption was sustainable as long as it remained sufficiently coordinated. Kedrick approached the table, standing across from Greaves. You enabled conspiracy that murdered my wife. You accepted bribes to ensure investigations remained inconclusive. You summoned me here intending to execute me for defending against crimes your office facilitated. So yes, this is extortion. But it's also justice delivered through the only channel your corruption left available. The Chancellor stared at the document, reading terms that stripped significant portion of Crown authority over northern territories while acknowledging governmental corruption at levels that would require investigations lasting years and consuming careers of officials who'd spent decades building positions they'd believed were secure. Finally, with hand that trembled slightly from rage or fear or recognition that centuries of accumulated authority had just been fractured by Duke willing to risk everything rather than accept subordination to systems that had betrayed him repeatedly, Lord Chancellor Greaves signed the document granting Ravenmarch autonomous authority while initiating Crown inquiry into ministerial conspiracy. The moment the quill left parchment, tension that had been building toward violence that would consume everyone present released into exhausted silence. Soldiers on both sides lowered weapons slightly, not standing down completely, but acknowledging that immediate threat of mutual slaughter had passed into realm of documentation and political maneuvering that would shape the kingdom's future through methods less immediately lethal than combat in confined spaces. Cedric took the signed document, folding it carefully before securing it inside his coat, where blood or fire or deliberate destruction would be required to eliminate evidence of agreement that had just been extracted through force. This doesn't end the conflict between Crown and Ravenmarch, but it establishes that my territory's survival doesn't depend on trusting authorities who've proven they can't be trusted. Everything else we negotiate from there. Greaves said nothing, face carved into expression that communicated he understood exactly what had just happened, that centuries of Crown authority, consolidating power through careful management of noble houses, had been shattered by Duke, who demonstrated that force applied at the right moment could accomplish what decades of diplomatic maneuvering never achieved. That precedent had been established, making it harder to deny similar autonomy to other territories that would inevitably demand equivalent treatment once Ravenmarch's successful defiance became widely known. The kingdom had just fractured in ways that would take generations to repair, if repair was even possible, given how thoroughly corruption had been exposed and how clearly violence had proven more effective than legal procedure at forcing accountability. Holt's soldiers began withdrawing from the hall in organized fashion, maintaining defensive positions while allowing palace guards to reclaim space without immediate conflict. The occupation had served its purpose. Continuing it would just create opportunities for misunderstanding or deliberate provocation to reignite violence that served no one's interest now that core objective had been achieved. Cedric turned toward the exit, Seraphina falling in to step beside him. 40 original soldiers reforming protective formation around them as they walked through corridors that had witnessed centuries of royal authority being exercised through methods that claimed legitimacy while operating through same violence they condemned when employed by others. Behind them, ministers and officials dissolved into chaos of recrimination and calculation, everyone trying to position themselves advantageously for investigations that would consume careers and potentially lives, depending on how. Thoroughly Crown decided to pursue accountability versus how effectively implicated officials could shift blame or manufacture defenses. None of that was Cedric's concern anymore. His objective had been accomplished. Ravenmarch's autonomy was documented and recognized. The conspiracy that killed Elise would face investigation that couldn't be suppressed through bribes, since the investigation itself was now a requirement of preventing civil war. And he'd survived to return to Fortress that would stand as autonomous territory rather than subordinate holding, controlled by Crown authority that had proven itself incapable of delivering anything except coordinated betrayal. But survival felt hollow in ways he hadn't anticipated. The victory was real, the autonomy secured, the justice initiated through methods that worked where legal procedure had failed. Yet walking through palace corridors surrounded by soldiers who'd just helped him force Crown capitulation through military occupation, Cedric felt less like triumphant duke and more like man who'd won battle, while losing something fundamental about who he'd been before the war started. The journey back to Ravenmarch took 6 days through territories that watched them pass, with expressions ranging from awe to fear to calculation about what Duke Thornwell's successful defiance meant for their own relationships with Crown authority and local nobles who'd been operating with impunity through coordination with officials now facing investigation and potential prosecution. News traveled faster than horses. By the 3rd day, writers brought reports that 17 noble houses had collapsed into internal conflict as family members turned on each other, trying to avoid being implicated in conspiracy that was now subject of royal inquiry, impossible to suppress through usual channels. 3 ministers had committed suicide rather than face interrogation. Crown officials throughout the kingdom were destroying correspondence and financial records in desperate attempts to eliminate evidence connecting them to bribes and coordination that had kept the system functioning for decades. The kingdom was tearing itself apart, trying to contain damage that Cedric had unleashed through refusing to accept that his wife's murder would go unpunished because addressing it truthfully would destabilize power structures built on carefully maintained illusions. Part of him felt satisfaction watching the system that had failed him collapse under weight of its own corruption. But larger part felt exhausted by understanding that the chaos consuming the kingdom would produce suffering for thousands of people who'd had nothing to do with conspiracy but would face consequences anyway, because that's how systemic collapse worked once started. Seraphina rode beside him through landscape that shifted from capital's ordered territories into northern regions where Ravenmarch's influence had maintained stability through methods Crown officials had condemned while benefiting from the results. She'd been quiet since leaving the palace, processing what they'd done and what it meant for future that had been fundamentally altered by choices made during hours of standoff where death had been immediate possibility, weighing on every word spoken. On the fifth night, camped in territory that belonged to Minor House, still calculating whether aligning with Ravenmarch offered better odds than maintaining traditional crown loyalty, she finally broke the silence that had settled between them like snow-covering graves. You got what you wanted. Autonomy, recognition, justice initiated for your wife's murder. But you look like someone who lost the battle instead of winning it. Kedrick stared at fire that had been built more for light than warmth since spring was finally arriving after winter that had felt permanent. I won the battle, but I lost the person I was before the battle became necessary, and I'm not certain the trade was worth what it cost. She said nothing for a moment, letting admission settle into space between them. Then quietly, who were you before? Someone who believed systems worked if you understood them correctly and operated within their constraints. Someone who thought power meant protection and control, prevented loss. Someone naive enough to imagine that love and loyalty and honor mattered more than accumulated wealth and coordinated violence. He picked up stick, pushing embers around without purpose. That person died when Elise did. What's left is just someone who learned the lessons too late to savor but early enough to prevent the same mistakes from destroying everything else. Those mistakes being trust and faith in institutions that claimed legitimacy. Those mistakes being believing that playing by rules mattered when people writing the rules were breaking them constantly while punishing anyone else who did the same. He looked up from the fire. I became exactly what my enemies claimed I was. Ruthless duke who eliminated threats through force and intimidated crown into capitulating rather than facing civil war. And it worked, which proves they were right about what was necessary for survival, even if they were wrong about why it was necessary. You sound like someone grieving the loss of illusions that were probably always illusions. Maybe. But illusions made the fortress feel like home instead of monument to accumulated violence that happened to include living quarters. His voice went quiet. When I stood in that palace forcing Greaves to sign documents granting autonomy, I felt nothing except satisfaction that strategy had worked. No triumph, no sense that justice had been served. Just cold recognition that I'd successfully applied force to achieve objective and survival required accepting that force was now primary language I spoke. The fire crackled in silence that followed. Somewhere in the camp, soldiers maintained watch over territory that was transitioning from crown-controlled to autonomous region where Duke. Thornwell's authority was absolute, and crown influence existed only to extent that Ravenmarch chose to recognize it. The future they'd fought for was arriving whether anyone was prepared for it or not. Seraphina moved slightly closer, voice carrying weight of someone who'd spent 6 days processing their own transformation through events that had reshaped both their lives. I came to Ravenmarch as collateral. My father sold to escape consequences of his failures. I expected to survive through strategic submission until opportunity for escape presented itself. But watching you fight for something beyond your own survival while refusing to become purely the weapon everyone claimed you were, that changed my calculation. She paused, choosing words carefully. You're not the monster your enemies described, but you're becoming one by accepting their definition of what strength requires. And if you continue down that path, eventually the fortress you're protecting will be ruled by someone wearing your face while operating from principles you would have rejected 2 years ago. Then what should I do? Pretend the violence was unnecessary. Apologize for surviving through methods that worked when nothing else did. Rebuild faith in systems that have proven they exist primarily to protect people wealthy enough to purchase protection while everyone else suffers consequences. No. You should accept that the person you were before is gone, and decide who you want to become now that survival is no longer the only priority consuming every decision. She met his eyes across firelight that made her features look carved from same stone as the fortress they were returning to. Ravenmarch is autonomous now. The conspiracy is exposed. Your wife's murder will face investigation. You've accomplished what you set out to do. The question is whether you spend the rest of your life fortifying against threats, or whether you start building something worth protecting beyond just the walls and the authority. What's worth protecting? The people inside the walls. The possibility that power might serve purpose beyond just accumulating more power. The chance that maybe your father's legacy of calculated violence can transform into something that doesn't. Require every generation to repeat the same brutal patterns while pretending they serve necessary purpose. That sounds like optimism. I'm not certain I'm capable of that anymore. Then learn. Because the alternative is ruling fortress that survives through fear and force while slowly becoming indistinguishable from the systems you just fought to escape. She stood, preparing to return to her tent. I didn't stand beside you during that confrontation because I thought you were perfect. I stood there because I believed you were capable of becoming better than circumstances tried to force you to become. Don't prove me wrong by deciding that survival requires permanent transformation into someone defined entirely by accumulated trauma and necessary violence. She left before he could formulate response, which was probably intentional since responses felt inadequate compared to truth she'd just delivered about trajectory he'd been following without fully acknowledging where it led. Alone again beside fire that had burned down to coals, Kaedric sat with understanding that he'd spent 2 years grieving his wife while systematically eliminating everything she'd valued about the person he'd been. Elise had loved him, not because he was Duke with power and authority, but because beneath the title and responsibility, he'd been someone who believed honor mattered and protecting people was purpose worth dedicating life toward. That person had been consumed by accumulated violence and betrayal, and realization that the systems claiming to serve protection actually served corruption that had killed her specifically to break him. But recognizing how he'd changed didn't mean accepting that change was permanent. Transformation could continue. The question was whether it continued toward becoming pure weapon existing solely to maintain power through force, or whether it shifted toward something that incorporated the lessons without being defined entirely by them. Whether the Duke who'd forced crown capitulation through military occupation could evolve into leader who used that power to build rather than just destroy. Whether survival through violence could transition into stability through something resembling the justice and honor that had been burned away through necessity. The fire died completely, leaving darkness broken only by stars that watched human conflicts with indifference that came from witnessing millennia of similar struggles, producing similar patterns. Kingdoms rose, kingdoms fell. People fought for power or justice or revenge or survival, and eventually they all became dust-feeding foundations for whatever came after. But in the moments before becoming dust, choices mattered. Not because they changed fundamental patterns, but because they determined whether the brief time existing as more than dust was spent building or destroying. Kaedric stood slowly, exhaustion settling into bones in ways that sleep wouldn't fully address, walking toward his tent where rest would be temporary reprieve rather than genuine recovery from accumulation of trauma and violence that had reshaped him into someone he barely recognized when catching glimpses in mirrors or reflected in eyes of soldiers who followed him out of loyalty built on shared risk rather than fear or obligation. Tomorrow, they would complete the journey to Ravenmarch, to fortress that was now autonomous territory answering to no authority except the Duke who'd fought to secure that autonomy through methods that had worked where everything else failed. And then the real work would begin. Not maintaining power, but determining what that power would serve beyond just its own preservation. Ravenmarch rose from the cliffs like monument that had survived everything history threw against it, through combination of strategic position, military strength, and willingness to do whatever survival required, regardless of cost. The banners snapped in wind that carried salt from sea below and brought news of approaching column returning from capital with autonomy secured through methods that would be debated for generations. Servants lined the courtyard as Kaedric rode through gates that had been designed to withstand siege warfare and had succeeded at that purpose for over a century. Their faces showed relief mixed with uncertainty about what Duke's return meant for daily operations and whether fortress that had operated as subordinate territory under Crown authority would transform into independent power operating by completely different principles. Captain Holt had ridden ahead to prepare reception and ensure security was maintained during transition period when territories surrounding Ravenmarch would be calculating whether challenging newly. Autonomous duchy offered opportunities or just guaranteed conflict with Duke, who demonstrated willingness to occupy royal palace with military force when necessary. But the courtyard felt different than when he'd left. Less like fortress preparing for war and more like home where people lived rather than just survived. Servants moved with efficiency that didn't require constant fear of punishment for mistakes. Guards maintained watch without the tension that came from expecting violence at any moment. Even the stones seemed less cold, warmed by spring sunlight that had finally broken through winter that had lasted far too long. Seraphina dismounted beside him, movements showing exhaustion from 6 days of riding, but face reflecting something that might have been satisfaction at having survived events that could easily have ended with both there. Deaths in palace halls surrounded by soldiers who would have been ordered to ensure no witnesses remained to testify about what crown officials had done to Duke, who exposed their corruption. She looked up at the towers, at banners displaying Thornwell colors that now represented autonomous authority rather than subordinate territory. We actually survived. I wasn't certain we would. Surviving was the easy part. Kedrick handed his horse to stable master, who'd served his father and would probably serve his children if he had any. Determining what to do with survival is harder because there's no immediate threat focusing all decisions towards single objective. Most people would consider that a blessing. Most people haven't spent 2 years building their entire identity around eliminating threats and accumulating power to prevent loss. When the threats are addressed and power is secured, what's left is just person trying to remember who they were before the war started. Then maybe the answer is accepting that you can't go back to who you were and need to decide who you want to become with the freedom that survival purchased. She started walking toward the main entrance. I'm going to chambers that have somehow become mine despite arriving here as collateral for debt I didn't create. You should rest. You look like someone who hasn't slept properly in weeks, months. But resting requires believing that threats won't materialize the moment attention shifts. And I'm not certain I believe that yet. Learn to believe it. Because the alternative is ruling fortress from war room for the next 40 years while slowly becoming paranoid tyrant who sees conspiracy. In every shadow and treats loyalty as commodity that requires constant demonstration rather than foundation built through earned trust. She disappeared into the fortress, leaving him standing in courtyard where he'd watched her arrive months ago as woman whose father had sold her to secure protection from Duke everyone feared. That first meeting had been confrontation where she'd refused to perform submission and he'd recognized someone capable of surviving the fortress that consumed most people who entered without sufficient strength or strategic thinking. Now she was the person he trusted most. Inside walls filled with people whose loyalty was probably genuine but could never be completely verified since Brennan's betrayal had demonstrated that even. 40 years of service meant nothing compared to accumulated resentment waiting for right moment to express itself through facilitating murder. That paranoia Seraphina had warned about was already present, growing, feeding on every interaction where perfect loyalty could also be perfect performance, concealing hostility that would eventually manifest through violence or betrayal or simple failure to prioritize his survival when situations forced choices. The question was whether he would let that paranoia define the rest of his rule, or whether he would find some way to trust people again despite understanding that trust was vulnerability that enemies could exploit. What bo? Brennan remained imprisoned in the old tower where Kedrick had ordered him confined after discovering the decades of betrayal that had facilitated Elise's murder. For 3 weeks, the old advisor had lived in chambers with stone walls and no windows. Food and water provided, but no communication with anyone except guards who delivered necessities without speaking. Kedrick hadn't visited, hadn't wanted to face the man who'd helped raise him while secretly planning revenge that would span generations and consume innocent people who'd had nothing to do with crimes committed by ancestors they'd never met. But on the 3rd day after returning from the capital, with autonomy secured and conspiracy exposed and no immediate threats demanding attention, the question of what to do with Brennan resurfaced into conscious thought, like wound that had been ignored while bigger injuries required treatment. He climbed the tower stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than it should, carrying weight of understanding that whatever happened during this conversation would determine whether he was capable of mercy or whether the transformation he'd undergone had eliminated that capacity completely. The guards outside Brennan's chambers nodded acknowledgement, unlocking the door without questions because Duke's orders didn't require explanation or justification beyond his authority to issue them. Inside, Brennan sat in chair near wall where window should have been, but was just stone interrupting any view that might have made imprisonment more tolerable. The old advisor looked thinner than 3 weeks ago, face drawn in ways that came from isolation and understanding that the career he'd built through patience and calculated. Betrayal had ended with him confined in tower of the very fortress he'd served while simultaneously working to destroy. He looked up as Kedrick entered, expression showing resignation that suggested he'd expected this visit and had already accepted whatever judgment was about to be delivered. Your Grace. The title came automatic but hollow. I assume you're here to deliver sentence now that more pressing matters have been resolved. Kadric closed the door, standing with back against it, studying the man who'd been constant presence throughout his life, who'd guided him through decisions and crises, who'd watched him grieve for 2 years while knowing exactly who was responsible for that grief. I came here to ask a question. The room held silence for a moment before Brennan spoke. Then asked, was it worth it? Facilitating my wife's murder to avenge grievances from 40 years ago, watching me suffer while collecting payment from conspirators, helping destroy the family you'd served for decades. Was the revenge worth what it cost? Brennan stared at him with eyes that had witnessed too much history and participated in too many betrayals to pretend innocence or regret would be convincing. Some days I believe it was worth every moment of patience and planning. Your father destroyed my family completely, murdered my father and brothers on fabricated charges, seized lands through corruption everyone pretended was legitimate authority, and House Thornwell prospered while my family's name became historical footnote about what happened to people who occupied territory dukes wanted. He paused, hands folding slowly in lap. Other days I remember the Duchess was kind to me, asked about my health when no one else noticed I was aging, defended me during council meetings when other nobles suggested younger advisors should replace me. She had nothing to do with your father's crimes, but I helped kill her anyway because her death served the revenge I'd been planning since I was 17 years old. So was it worth it? I don't know. Revenge satisfied something that had been consuming me for 40 years. But the cost was becoming exactly the kind of person I swore I'd destroy when Lord Matthias forced me into service. The honesty was unexpected. Kadric had anticipated either defiance or performative regret designed to earn mercy. Instead, Brennan offered truth that recognized the complexity of revenge that satisfied while also consuming the person pursuing it. My father was a monster who built power through calculated violence against people who couldn't defend themselves. You're right about that. Kadric moved away from the door, sitting in chair across from the old advisor. But you spent 40 years becoming similar monster while telling yourself the difference was that your violence served justice rather than ambition. And now you're here trying to determine whether transformation was worth what it accomplished. Brennan nodded slowly. Which is why I suspect you came here. Not to deliver sentence, but to see whether I could provide insight about trajectory you followed since discovering your wife was murdered. You're asking whether becoming the ruthless duke everyone feared was necessary, or whether it was just. Convenient excuse to justify violence that felt satisfying regardless of whether it served genuine purpose. The accuracy made Kadric's jaw tighten. I forced crown capitulation through military occupation of royal palace. I've executed or imprisoned 43 noble families. I've secured autonomy that makes Ravenmarch independent power answering to no authority except my own judgment. And I feel nothing except exhausted recognition that the person who rode to capital isn't the same person who returned. Then you understand the cost of revenge pursued to its logical conclusion. Victory that feels hollow, because the person celebrating it isn't the person who started the journey. Brennan leaned forward slightly. Your father destroyed my family, so I destroyed something you loved. You discovered that destruction and responded by destroying everyone responsible, plus dozens of peripheral participants who may or may not have deserved elimination. And eventually, if the pattern continues, someone will seek revenge against you for eliminating their family. And the cycle perpetuates until everyone involved is dead or too exhausted to continue fighting. So what breaks the cycle? Someone choosing to stop pursuing revenge even when revenge is justified. Someone accepting that the person they've become in pursuit of justice has consumed the person they were before injustice occurred. Someone deciding that maybe the next generation doesn't need to inherit the same patterns of violence and betrayal. The old advisor stood slowly, moving to where window should have been, staring at stone wall like it was view of territories he'd never see again. I can't be that person. I've lived too long and done too many things that can't be undone or forgiven. But you could be. You're young enough that transformation isn't permanent. Strong enough that mercy wouldn't be interpreted as weakness by people still calculating whether challenging you offers opportunity. And you have someone standing beside you who understands the cost of revenge while also believing you're capable of becoming better than circumstances tried to force you to become. You're saying I should show you mercy you don't deserve. I'm saying you should show yourself mercy by not letting my betrayal define the rest of your rule. Execute me, exile me, confine me for the rest of my natural life, whatever serves your purposes. But don't let what I did transform you into a person incapable of trust or loyalty or belief that some People might actually serve you out of genuine respect rather than fear or calculated self-interest. Cedric sat in silence, processing wisdom that came from man who'd betrayed him completely, while somehow still caring enough to offer advice about avoiding similar fate. The irony was almost overwhelming, that the person who'd helped destroy his life was now trying to prevent him from destroying himself through pursuing revenge to point where nothing remained except fortress ruled by paranoid tyrant. When he finally spoke, voice carried exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness into spiritual weariness that came from understanding transformation he'd undergone had cost more than any victory was worth. You'll remain confined here, not as prisoner awaiting execution, but as advisor whose counsel I'll seek when I need reminder about where unchecked revenge leads. You'll live with understanding that the conspiracy you facilitated was exposed, and everyone involved will face justice you tried to prevent. And you'll spend however many years you have left knowing that House Thornwell survived your betrayal, while maintaining capacity for mercy. You didn't show my wife. That's punishment worse than execution. That's the point. Death would be mercy. Living with consequences of your choices while watching fortress you tried to destroy. Prosper specifically because I refuse to become purely the weapon your revenge tried to forge me into. That's justice that serves purpose beyond just satisfying my desire for vengeance. He stood, moving toward the door, pausing at threshold. My father was monster who destroyed your family. I'm sorry for that. It doesn't excuse what you did, but it explains it. And maybe acknowledging that is first step toward breaking cycles that have consumed too many generations already. The door closed on Brennan's face, showing surprise that Duke capable of forcing crown capitulation through military occupation was also capable of mercy toward man who'd facilitated the murder of his wife. Spring transformed Ravenmarch in ways winter had made impossible to imagine. Flowers appeared in courtyards where snow had dominated for months. Servants opened windows that had been sealed against cold, letting air circulate through halls that had felt like tomb. Trade caravans arrived bringing goods and news of kingdom, still adjusting to Duke Thornwell's successful defiance in crown inquiry, and to ministerial corruption that was producing trials, consuming officials who'd believed their positions made them untouchable. The fortress felt alive again, not just occupied, but inhabited by people who understood they were building something rather than just surviving. Inside walls that protected them from external threats, while crushing them through internal oppression. Cedric spent weeks establishing administrative structures for autonomous duchy that required different governance than territory subordinate to crown authority. Legal codes needed revision. Trade agreements required renegotiation. Military organization had to adapt to defending borders without crown support, while ensuring enough strength that neighboring territories calculated attacking Ravenmarch was suicidal proposition. But beneath the practical work of governance, he was trying to determine who he wanted to become now that survival was no longer sole priority demanding every decision. The ruthless duke who'd forced crown capitulation existed. That person had accomplished objectives that seemed impossible when Journey started. But continuing as purely that person meant ruling through fear and force for next 40 years while slowly becoming paranoid tyrant Seraphina had warned about. The alternative required vulnerability he wasn't certain he could sustain. Trust that people might serve him genuinely rather than through fear or calculation. Faith that systems could function without requiring constant suspicion and verification. Acceptance that opening himself to possibility of betrayal was necessary cost of building something worth more than just accumulated power. On evening 3 months after returning from capital, he found Seraphina in library where she spent increasing amounts of time researching historical precedents for autonomous territories and strategies that had allowed them to maintain independence without constant warfare consuming resources and lives. She looked up from documents as he entered, expression showing both concentration and something that might have been satisfaction at having found information relevant to current challenges. I've been reviewing records of the Eastern Territories during the independence period 200 years ago. They maintained autonomy for 60 years through combination of defensive fortifications and strategic marriages that created alliances, strong enough to deter aggression while avoiding entanglements that would drag them into conflicts serving other kingdoms' interests. Strategic marriages. His tone was carefully neutral. That's remarkably relevant given our current situation. She set down the documents, meeting his eyes directly in a way that communicated whatever she was about to say had been carefully considered. Our marriage contract was arranged by my father to secure protection from your influence. We've never discussed whether that contract still serves any purpose now that circumstances have changed completely. It serves the purpose of keeping you here, which is selfishly what I want, regardless of whether the contract is legitimate basis for that desire. That's remarkably honest for Duke, known for calculated strategies and political maneuvering. I'm tired of strategies that require pretending I don't care about things that actually matter. He moved closer to where she sat, surrounded by historical documents and maps. You stood beside me when standing beside me meant potential death in Palace Hall. You've counseled me toward becoming better than circumstances tried to force me to become. And you've transformed Fortress that felt like monument to accumulated violence into something that might actually qualify as home. She studied his face, searching for performance or manipulation, or any indication this was strategy rather than genuine admission. What are you asking? I'm asking whether the woman who arrived here as collateral, her father sold, would consider remaining as partner I choose rather than obligation I'm contractually bound to maintain. Marriage not as political arrangement, but as alliance between two people who've survived things that should have, destroyed them, and decided survival should lead somewhere beyond just accumulating more power to defend against threats. The library fell silent except for wind moving through open windows that brought scent of flowers blooming in courtyard below. Seraphina's expression shifted through calculation before settling into something softer that she rarely allowed herself to show. You're proposing actual marriage, not arrangement or contract, but commitment between equals. I'm proposing partnership where we build something worth protecting beyond just walls and authority, where the fortress becomes more than defense against external threats and starts serving purpose that makes the survival worth what it cost. He paused, choosing words carefully. I can't promise I won't make mistakes, or that transformation is complete, or that paranoia won't resurface when situations trigger responses built through 2 years of accumulated betrayal. But I can promise I'll try to become someone worthy of the loyalty you've shown when loyalty required standing beside person everyone else wanted destroyed. She stood slowly, moving close enough that speaking required dropping voices to level that made conversation intimate rather than formal. I came to Ravenmarch expecting to survive through strategic submission until escape was possible. But watching you fight for more than just your own survival, while refusing to become purely weapon everyone claimed you were, that transformed calculation into something I didn't expect. Which was respect for Duke willing to face consequences of his choices, rather than sacrificing subordinates to maintain his position. Trust that someone who'd been betrayed as thoroughly as you were could still extend trust to person whose father had tried to use her as leverage. And recognition that maybe surviving together serves both our interests better than surviving separately, while pretending alliances are just strategic rather than genuine. So that's a yes. That's acceptance of proposal that transforms political arrangement into commitment between people who've decided they're stronger together than isolated behind walls that protect. While also imprisoning. The words hung between them like vows spoken without ceremony or witnesses, but carrying more weight than any formal declaration could contain. Two people who'd been thrown together by circumstances neither chose, who'd survived conspiracies and betrayals and violence that should have destroyed them, deciding that maybe survival could transition into something approaching actual life rather than just prolonged defense against inevitable collapse. Kedrick pulled her closer, movement tentative in a way that communicated he was offering rather than taking, waiting for response that confirmed this was mutual decision rather than assertion of authority he possessed but was choosing not to exercise. She came willingly, which answered questions that neither of them had been willing to ask directly until this moment when exhaustion and accumulated survival created space for acknowledging that maybe partnership mattered more than pride or fear of vulnerability. They stood together in library filled with history of territories that had risen and fallen based on decisions made by people trying to navigate similar conflicts between power and principle, between survival and ethics that felt impossible to maintain when circumstances demanded brutality. Every book on those shelves represented someone's attempt to document pattern or extract meaning from chaos that consumed kingdoms and lives with equal indifference. But in this moment, surrounded by accumulated wisdom that often contradicted itself, they weren't trying to extract meaning from history. They were simply two people deciding that maybe the future could be different than patterns suggesting inevitable repetition of violence and betrayal. Maybe the fortress that had been built on foundations of calculated cruelty could transform into something that protected without consuming. Maybe the Duke who'd been forged through grief and fury could evolve into leader who wielded power without becoming defined entirely by it. Maybe the woman who'd arrived as collateral could help build institution that served more than just self-preservation. Or maybe they would fail, and the fortress would eventually fall, and everything they tried to build would collapse into ruins that future generations would study while making the same mistakes with. Different justifications. But at least the attempt would matter. At least trying to build something beyond just accumulated power and defensive violence would represent choice rather than acceptance of inevitable patterns. At least they would face whatever came next together, rather than isolated behind walls that protected while also imprisoning everyone inside them. Outside the library windows, Ravenmarch's banners snapped in wind, carrying salt and spring warmth and promise that winter eventually ended, even when it felt permanent. The fortress rose from cliffs like monument that had survived everything history threw against it through combination of strategic position, military strength, and willingness to adapt when adaptation was necessary for survival. Inside those walls, a duke who'd forced crown capitulation through methods that terrified enemies and concerned allies was learning that maybe the greatest strength wasn't just capacity for violence, but also capacity for rebuilding trust after betrayal had shattered it. That maybe leading meant more than just eliminating threats, and could include creating conditions where threats became less likely because people had something worth protecting beyond just their own survival. The transformation wouldn't be quick or easy, or without setbacks that made progress feel impossible. But it had begun. Not through grand declaration or public ceremony, but through quiet decision between two people who'd survived things that should have destroyed them and decided survival should lead somewhere beyond just preparing for next battle. Far above the sea cliffs, beneath banners displaying Thornwell colors that now represented autonomous authority earned through force but maintained through something approaching wisdom, the Duke and future Duchess of Ravenmarch stood together overlooking fortress that had nearly consumed them both. Not controlled by contract or fear or obligation inherited from generations past. Not defined solely by capacity for violence that had secured survival when nothing else would. But chosen. Deliberately and consciously chosen as partners building future that might break patterns of accumulated cruelty or might just represent different version of same violence dressed in prettier language. Either way, they would face it together. And maybe that was enough to make the survival worth what it had cost to achieve.